Every night when you sleep deeply, the heavier sleep that sits underneath the dreams, something like an hour of your life disappears. Not dimmed or muffled, actually absent. By every measure we have, you are not there during that hour. And then, without any fanfare, you come back. You wake up and resume being the person you were, as if no gap had ever opened. Nobody has ever been surprised by this. We've been doing it since we were small, but if you pause on it for a moment, really pause, it's a little stranger than we usually let it be. Somewhere between the pillow and the morning, you were subtracted from the world and added back in. A small, nightly vanishing that we accept without thinking because it reverses. Every time, and so far every time, has been enough to keep the question from quite forming. But the question is there, even if it never shows up in words, even if you've never put it into a sentence, sitting somewhere near the edge of most of your nights. What happens when it doesn't reverse? Not as a fear, exactly, and not as a puzzle to be solved. More like a small, specific silence, the kind that settles into a room where someone has just died, which anyone who has been in that room will recognize. Something is missing that wasn't missing 5 minutes ago, and we don't quite have language for what it is. Most of us, most of the time, notice this question just long enough for it to be uncomfortable, and then set it down because nothing useful seems to come of holding it too long. That response is reasonable, and also, quietly, what eats at us. So tonight, for a little while, we're going to hold it anyway. Not to answer it, but just to see what it's like to sit next to it without flinching. There turns out to be a lot of company in here. More, probably, than you'd think. There is a small novel by Tolstoy, written in 1886, that opens with a judge's funeral. Ivan Ilyich Golovin was 45 years old. He had lived the life a man in his position was meant to live. Good schools, the right appointments, a marriage that was at first agreeable and then not quite, 2 surviving children, an apartment that cost slightly more than he could afford, the kind of life that looks from the outside like a success, and that anyone living it could describe with reasonable accuracy from their own front door. He had been promoted the previous spring. The new post meant a new apartment in Petersburg, which meant, among other small pleasures, the selection of curtains. Ivan took the business of the apartment very seriously. He chose the wallpaper himself. He argued with the upholsterer about the trim on a chaise. He was, in his own way, happy, the kind of small, proprietary happiness that comes from arranging a life into its proper compartments. One afternoon, on a stepladder, adjusting a drape that wasn't falling the way he wanted, he slipped. Not far. He caught himself on the window frame and struck his side against the handle of the casement. He laughed about it afterward. He told his wife it was nothing, a bruise at worst, and showed her later where the ache still sat. A small, particular soreness low on his left side, the kind you forget about for an hour and then remember when you turn the wrong way. The ache never quite went. It settled in. Over the following months it became not just an ache, but a companion, one he grew to resent and then to fear and then, very slowly, to understand as something other than a bruise. His doctors couldn't agree. One said kidney, another said appendix, a third proposed something vaguer and charged more for it. Ivan took the medicines, kept the appointments, tried to carry on. The pain kept its own schedule. By the 4th month he could no longer sit comfortably at his desk. By the 5th, he was mostly in bed. By the 7th, he was dying, and he knew it. And this knowing, the strange, specific weight of it, is the subject of Tolstoy's book, and in some sense of every honest page ever written about being a person. Because here is the thing Tolstoy noticed, and that a reader, if they let the book work on them, tends to notice too. Ivan had always known he was mortal. Everyone does. The fact is available to any child who has stood near an animal that stopped moving. It's taught in schools, confirmed at funerals, reinforced by every newspaper. There is no adult on earth who does not, in some sense, know it. And yet when the knowledge finally arrived in Ivan's body, when the ache stopped being a bruise and started being a life, he was astonished by it, and not intellectually. He had the arguments. He remembered the proofs. In school, he had been shown the old syllogism, the one every student in his generation had been shown. All men are mortal. Caesar is a man, therefore Caesar is mortal. A simple chain of reasoning, clean as a bell. And Ivan, lying in his bed, finds himself thinking about it. What he finds as he thinks is that the syllogism is absolutely convincing when applied to Caesar. Caesar is mortal, yes, undoubtedly. But when applied to Ivan, to the particular Vanya who had a mother named Maria Fyodorovna, who as a boy had a striped ball that he loved specifically more than his other toys, who remembered the smell of his nursery and the precise way the light came through the schoolroom window, the syllogism simply doesn't close. It rings false, though not because the logic is bad. The logic is fine, perfect even. It's just that Caesar and Vanya turn out to be, on closer inspection, very different kinds of object. Caesar is a category, Vanya is a person, and the syllogism works beautifully on categories and does not somehow quite reach the person underneath. There's something here in what Tolstoy is pointing at that explains a lot about how most of us go through our days. If you had asked Ivan on the afternoon before he slipped on the ladder whether he knew he was going to die one day, he would have said yes, of course, and he would have meant it. The knowledge was there. It was accessible, and he could have produced it on request. But it lived in the part of the mind where Caesar lives, out in the third person, among the categories, somewhere a bit to the left of his own actual life. It had not arrived yet in the place where the striped ball was kept. And this, it turns out, is not a flaw in Ivan. It is a feature of how the mind holds certain kinds of knowing. There's a way of knowing something abstractly, knowing it about people, about the species, about the statistics. That is very different from knowing it in the first person, and we live, most of us, most of the time, almost entirely in the first mode. This isn't because we're shallow or in denial. The other mode is simply difficult to hold for long. It warps the furniture. You can notice this in how people actually talk about dying. Listen sometime, at a dinner party, in a waiting room, at a funeral that isn't yours. We have a specific grammar for it. Someone passed. They are no longer with us. The passive voice gets a workout. We say things like "one never knows" or "anything can happen," the subject of the sentence sliding comfortably away from any particular person. Even the phrase "everyone dies," so direct on the page, does a quiet trick when spoken out loud. If everyone dies, then no one in particular does. The universal, at a certain volume, becomes a kind of anonymity. There was a philosopher in the 20th century who had a phrase for this. He said that the way ordinary speech handles death, the way we talk about it without really talking about it, has a hidden grammar. When people say one dies, what they are actually producing, down underneath, is the sentence "nobody dies." Because one, in that usage, is a crowd, a generality, Caesar, not Vanya. The speaker remains always the slight exception. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He wasn't pointing out a moral failure. He was just noticing the machine. We have a specific way of speaking and thinking that keeps the knowledge at the level of category, and this way of speaking isn't a mistake. It's how the machinery stays operable. A person who held the first-person version of that knowledge at full volume continuously would have trouble choosing curtains. Here is where Tolstoy and this philosopher meet, 70 years apart, without ever having read each other. Both of them notice that there are two kinds of knowing death, and that almost all of us, almost all of the time, hold only the first. Ivan Ilyich held the first. So did every colleague at his office. So did his doctors. So did his wife. So, for long stretches, does almost anyone listening now. The ladder and the window handle did not give Ivan some new information. They moved the information from one part of the mind to the other, which raises a question worth holding for a moment. What would it look like to move it on purpose? Not by accident or illness, not because some ladder slipped, but deliberately to hold for a little while the first-person version, to know you're mortal not as a fact about the species, but as a fact about the specific person now breathing slowly in and out in the position you're currently in, the weight of the body settled into the bed or the chair, the small rise and fall, to let the knowledge cross from the category into the person. Most of us don't try, not because we're cowards, but because it's genuinely hard and the ordinary furniture of life depends on not trying. But there have been people here and there across history who did try, who made a project of it, who, when their own ladder finally came, were strange enough to meet it calmly and to talk, while it was happening, about what they had been thinking about for years. One of them drank a cup of poison in an Athenian cell in the spring of 399 BC. He was surrounded by 15 friends, most of them in tears. He himself was unhurried. He was finishing a conversation. Chapter 2, Hemlock, Slowly. The cell was not far from the agora, down a short flight of steps in a building the Athenians used for prisoners awaiting execution. It was a plain room. A bench along one wall, a window high up, the kind of light you get in Mediterranean stone rooms in the morning, which is clear and a little cool and comes in at an angle. There were 15 of them there that day, maybe 16, the ones who had been close to Socrates during the trial and the long month afterward. Phaedo, a young man from Elis, was one of them, which is the reason we have any record of the conversation at all. The others we know mostly by name. Crito, who had been Socrates' oldest friend. Simmias and Cebes, serious men, former students of a Pythagorean teacher, the kind of careful-minded friends you'd want in a room like that. Apollodorus, who Phaedo says cried the hardest and most unhelpfully, and a few more. Xanthippe, Socrates' wife, was also there when they first arrived, holding their youngest child. When she saw Socrates, she cried out in the particular way wives cry out in these situations, and Socrates, gently, asked Crito to have someone take her home. It reads a little cold on the page, but it wasn't. He wanted the afternoon for a conversation, and he knew her grief would make that conversation impossible, and he also knew she didn't want it. The jailer came and unbound his legs. Socrates sat up on the bench, bent his knee, and rubbed the place where the chain had been. He said, to no one in particular, that it was a strange thing, how closely pleasure and pain were bound together. You would think they'd be opposites, he said, and yet here one is, following right after the other, as though some god had tied them together by the heads and was amused by the pairing. This is the first thing he says in the dialogue that Plato later wrote down, or reconstructed or invented, we'll never quite know, and people have been reading it for 2,500 years trying to decide whether Socrates is joking, philosophizing, or simply making the kind of observation a man makes when he's noticed that his ankle doesn't hurt anymore. Probably all three. That was the kind of man he was. The friends settled around him on benches and on the floor. Someone, maybe Cebes, said something about how odd it was that Socrates, a man known for not writing poetry, had spent his last weeks in prison putting Aesop's fables into verse, and Socrates answered lightly that he'd had a recurring dream all his life telling him to make music, and he had always assumed it meant philosophy, which was a kind of music, but now, at the end, he thought maybe he should try the other kind just in case. He was making jokes, he kept making them in various ways for most of the day, but the core of what happened in that room, the thing Plato wrote the dialogue to preserve, was an argument, or rather, a conversation that kept circling back to an argument. The friends wanted to know, and they were not embarrassed to ask, whether Socrates really believed what he seemed to believe, which was that he was going to be fine. That death was not a catastrophe. That whatever was about to happen when he drank the poison was not, in fact, the end of him. The friends were unconvinced. Cebes, in particular, the careful-minded one, kept pressing him on it. He wanted a reason. He wanted more than courage and composure. He wanted something like a proof, and Socrates, remarkably, was willing to try to give him one. Several actually over the course of the afternoon, 4 of them if you count them up, though the numbering is a later convention. They get more ambitious as the day goes on and none of them is entirely watertight, and Socrates, being Socrates, keeps pointing out the gaps himself. But one of them is worth pausing on because it has the quality of a thought experiment rather than a formal argument, and it gets at something that people have been chewing on ever since. Here is what he asks them. You know what it's like, he says, when someone teaches you a piece of geometry. Not by telling you the answer, but by drawing lines in the sand and asking questions, so that eventually you produce the answer yourself, and you have the unmistakable feeling, everyone who has been through this recognizes it, of having already known it in some way before the teacher asked, as though the answer was already in you and the questions were just uncovering it. The teacher doesn't insert the geometry into your head. The teacher helps you find something that was somehow there. Fine, so where was it? You hadn't learned it in this life, not in any ordinary sense. You hadn't been taught it. And yet, given the right prompts, you could produce it and recognize it as familiar and build on it. That recognition, that sense of, oh, of course I knew that, has a strange flavor to it. It doesn't feel like learning, it feels like remembering. Socrates thought this was a clue. The soul, he suggested, must have known these things before it arrived in the body. Otherwise, where would the recognition come from? And if the soul existed before the body, that's at least one piece of evidence, he wouldn't claim more, that it doesn't depend on the body for its existence. It came from somewhere. Presumably it can go somewhere. You can poke holes in this. People have been poking holes in it for a very long time. Maybe what feels like remembering is just the mind's way of recognizing deep patterns. Maybe there's nothing more to it than a particular sensation that shows up when pieces click into place. Fair enough. Socrates himself didn't pretend the argument was airtight. What he claimed was that it was suggestive, that it was the kind of thing a reasonable person could take seriously, could lean on a little in the absence of better information. He was a man who had spent his life noticing how hard it is to know anything for certain. He wasn't going to suddenly claim certainty at the end, but here is where the scene becomes something more than an argument, because eventually, late in the afternoon, the jailer came back. He was apologetic. He liked Socrates. He said the sun was near the hills, and it was time if Socrates was ready. And Socrates asked, mildly, what the procedure was. The jailer explained it. You drink the cup. You walk a little to help the poison move. When your legs feel heavy, you lie down, and it works its way up from there. Socrates nodded. He drank the cup. Phaedo says he did it without any fuss, the way a man might drink a cup of water after a long day. He walked a little. He lay down. The jailer touched his feet after a few minutes and asked if he could feel it, and Socrates said no, not quite. The numbness was moving up. He was quiet for a while. Then, near the end, he pulled aside the cloth that had been covering his face and said to Crito, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it. Don't forget. And then he covered himself again, and that was the last thing he said. People have been arguing about that sentence for 24 centuries. Asclepius was the god of healing. You sacrificed a cock to him when you got better from an illness, a small offering, customary, almost a thank you note. So the last thing Socrates said as the poison climbed his legs was something like, remember to thank the god of healing, as though he had just been cured of something. You can read this a dozen ways. Some people have read it as a joke, gallows humor, one last nudge to his friends. Others have read it as a real conviction that the body was an illness and death was the cure. Some have thought it a deflection, a throwaway line to avoid saying anything heavier. Some have read it as evidence that Socrates, after all the arguments of the afternoon, had simply made his peace and wanted to mark the moment with the ordinary gesture a man makes when he feels his troubles are lifting. What no one has ever quite been able to do is settle the question. Was Socrates genuinely unafraid? Had all that careful argument, all those conversations over the years actually delivered him to somewhere where he could meet the poison without flinching? Or had he simply, through long practice, through the kind of performance a serious person can give even to himself, talked himself into something that looked, from the outside, like peace? This is the harder question, and it's not one we can answer from the page. Plato wrote the dialogue, and Plato was a brilliant admirer of his teacher, and Plato had his own reasons for wanting Socrates to appear composed in the final scene. The truth of what went on inside Socrates in those last minutes is not in the dialogue. It is necessarily on the other side of a door we cannot open, which leaves us, as readers, with the version we have. A man, 69 years old, surrounded by friends arguing cheerfully about the soul through the long afternoon, drinking the cup when it was brought, making one last small joke as the numbness reached his chest. If it was performance, it was the kind of performance a person can only give after a lifetime of rehearsal. And if it wasn't, it was the rarer thing. A man who had actually, by some combination of argument and temperament and sheer accumulated practice, gotten himself to the place he'd been aiming at. So here is the question worth putting down, gently, before we leave that room. If you were in Phaedo's seat, on the floor, watching, would you have believed him? And the harder version, if it were you on the bench with the cup coming, which of those two Socrateses would you want to be? The one who really believed, or the one who only looked like he did? Most of us, told honestly, would want to believe, but wanting to believe and believing are not the same thing, and Socrates, of all people, would have been the first to point that out. It's worth noticing that he never once, in the whole afternoon, said he was certain. He said he had reasons. He said the reasons were good enough to lean on. He went to the cup anyway, not because he knew, but because the leaning was sufficient. That is a different thing from certainty, and it is probably closer to what most of us actually have access to on any real question we care about. 250 miles to the east, and 70 years after Socrates was buried, a different kind of man lay dying, in a garden outside the same city, in a great deal of physical pain, and wrote a letter that took almost the opposite view of the one Socrates had defended, and that, in its own quieter way, also asked to be believed. The letter survives only because someone copied it, and then someone copied the copy, and so on down a long chain of scribes across the centuries, most of them working without any idea that they were preserving one of the strangest documents in the history of philosophy. It is short. It is addressed to a former student, a man named Idomeneus, who had gone on to serve as a minister in a provincial court, and it opens with a line that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. On this truly blessed day of my life, the letter begins, which is also the last, I am writing to you. The man writing it was 71 years old. His name was Epicurus. He had founded a small philosophical community in Athens about 30 years earlier, in a garden he'd bought outside the city walls, and for 3 decades he had been teaching there. Not lecturing exactly, more like conducting a long, unhurried conversation with a rotating cast of friends. He wrote letters constantly. Many of them survive in fragments, quoted by later authors who wanted to argue with him, or occasionally to agree with him, but mostly to argue. On the morning he wrote this particular letter, he was in severe pain and had been for over a week. Kidney stones by his own description. Dysentery. He had not been able to pass water for some time. The pain, he says plainly, is at the highest pitch a body can produce. And then, in the same sentence, almost without pausing, he writes the thing that has been troubling readers ever since. Yet all these are counterbalanced by the joy I feel in my soul at the memory of our conversations. He died later that day. We think he died later that day. The chronology is reconstructed from other sources, but the letter itself is the evidence of the hours just before, and the tone of it is not the tone of a man performing composure. It is the tone of a man describing, matter-of-factly, what he is actually experiencing. Unbearable pain in one hand, joy in the other, not joy despite the pain or joy overcoming the pain. Just both things side by side, occupying the same body in the same moment, and the man noticing this and writing it down for a friend. You can read this and decide he was deluded. Plenty of people have. Or you can decide he was a genius of self-management, a man whose long practice had produced a capacity most of us do not have and could not easily learn. But before you decide, it's worth understanding what he actually thought he was doing, because his view of death was almost perfectly opposed to the view Socrates had defended 72 years earlier in the cell across town, and understanding that opposition is worth the time. Epicurus did not believe the soul was immortal. He did not believe in an afterlife. He thought the universe was made of atoms and empty space, and that everything we call a soul, thinking, feeling, the whole interior weather of a person, was a particular arrangement of very fine atoms moving around inside the body. When the body stops, the arrangement breaks up. The atoms drift off and do other things, and the person, as a person, simply is not there anymore. This is, on the face of it, a much more frightening picture than Socrates. Socrates had offered his friends the hope of continuation. The soul goes somewhere, sees something, persists. Epicurus offers nothing of the kind. The person ends, full stop. And yet, Epicurus, the one with the bleaker sounding metaphysics, is the one who seems to have been genuinely unafraid, which is interesting and makes you wonder whether the metaphysics were doing less work than most of us assume. His argument, which he stated in various forms over the years, runs something like this. Death, he says, is nothing to you, not in some grand mystical sense, just in the plain practical sense. Death means the cessation of sensation, and sensation is what all our goods and ills are made of. Pain is a sensation. Pleasure is a sensation. Fear, longing, regret, all of them need a sensing creature to exist. So whenever death arrives, sensation is no longer present, and therefore neither is anything good or bad for the person in question. The moment death is, you aren't. The moment you are, death isn't. The two of you never actually meet. People misunderstand this argument constantly, usually by assuming it's a trick, some kind of word game. Of course, death is bad. Look at all the things you lose, look at the grief of your family, look at everything you won't get to do. But that's not quite the claim Epicurus is making. He's not saying dying is painless, or that being killed is no big deal, or that the loss to others doesn't matter. He's saying something more specific. He's saying that being dead is not itself a condition you will ever experience as bad. You will not be there to experience it as anything, and a state you will never experience cannot harm you as a subject, because the subject by then is gone. You can still dislike the process. You can still fear the run-up. You can still mourn the people you love in advance of losing them. Epicurus isn't pretending any of that is nothing. What he's pointing out is narrower and sharper. Fear of being dead, the dread of the condition itself, the shudder at the idea of no longer existing. This particular fear, he says, is directed at a non-event. It's worry aimed at a place where there will be no one to be worried about. There's a thought experiment his student Lucretius developed a generation after his teacher's death that brings this out very cleanly. You are not troubled, Lucretius says, by the vast stretch of time before you were born. You don't lie awake worrying about the 13.5 billion years of the universe that ran without you in it. That nothing is not experienced by you as a loss or a terror or even a mild regret. It's simply not there in your emotional life as anything at all. Fine, he says. Now turn around. Look at the matching stretch on the other side. The years after you die, also a period you will not be present for. Why does one of them feel like nothing and the other like a catastrophe? They are, from the point of view of your eventual non-presence, exactly the same thing. A symmetry. If you are honest, Lucretius says, the worry you have about the second stretch ought to be scaled to match the worry you have about the first, which is 0. You weren't there, and you won't be there. and neither fact should be particularly distressing. The asymmetry we feel is a trick of the mind, of being alive now and looking forward from here. Nature, he says, holds up a mirror to us, showing us what is to come after we die, and the image in the mirror is simply the time before we were born, a period we have always handled fine. This is an elegant piece of reasoning, and it has bothered people for 2,000 years because they can feel that something is off about it, but it takes a surprising amount of work to locate exactly what. One objection was articulated very precisely in a short essay published in 1970 by an American philosopher working at Princeton. He didn't deny that you won't be present to experience your own absence. He granted that, but he pointed out that this isn't actually what makes death feel bad. What makes death feel bad is not the experience of being dead, there isn't one, but the deprivation of everything it cuts off. All the futures that won't happen, all the conversations that won't be had, all the sunrises on all the mornings you won't see. A person who dies young loses decades of possible life, and we feel this loss is real even though the dead person isn't around to register it. His analogy was unusual and worth pausing on. Imagine, he said, a highly intelligent adult who suffers a brain injury and is reduced permanently to the mental life of a contented infant. The person is no longer suffering. They are in fact quite happy, cared for, comfortable, smiling at bright objects. From inside, there is nothing bad going on, and yet when you hear about this person, something in you recoils. You feel that something terrible has happened, even though the current resident of that body is fine. The terribleness is not in the current experience, it's in the gap, in the life that was supposed to be there and isn't, in everything that got cancelled. Death, he was arguing, is like this. The person isn't around to feel harmed, but the harm is still real, measured against the life that didn't get to unfold. Being dead isn't a bad experience, it's no experience. But being deprived of everything you would otherwise have had, that's a genuine loss, even if there's no one left to lose it. So which of them is right? Here is the strange thing. They might both be right, each about a different piece of the thing. Epicurus is probably right that the specific dread of being dead, the cold shudder at the idea of not existing, is directed at a phantom. There will be no one in there to suffer the non-existence. The quality of death from the inside is not a terrible experience. It's the absence of any experience at all. And absences don't hurt their occupants, because absences don't have occupants. And the Princeton argument is probably also right that there is still something bad about death, just located somewhere else. Not in the person's future experience, but in the shape of a life measured against what it might have contained. The loss is real. It's just not the kind of loss that happens to anyone. It's the kind that happens instead of someone. You can hold both of these at once, and something interesting happens when you do. The fear deflates a little, because a lot of what we feel, most of us, when we contemplate our own ending, is that cold shudder that Epicurus diagnosed, and his diagnosis is probably correct about that particular fear. But the grief doesn't disappear. The loss remains a loss because lives have shapes, and a life cut short has the shape of a sentence interrupted in the middle of a word. You don't need the sentence to keep suffering the interruption. The interruption is itself a thing about the sentence, which is maybe as much as a careful philosopher working with just the tools of argument can hope to arrive at. You can clear away the phantom fear, you can preserve the real loss. What you cannot do, from a chair in Athens or a chair in Princeton, is look inside the body at the moment the sentence stops and see what, if anything, is happening there. That has become possible, in a limited way, only very recently. It's been possible for about a dozen years, and the thing researchers have found, when they've been able to look, has surprised almost everyone, including the researchers themselves. In the summer of 2013, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan published a paper that she had been sitting on for over a year because the results were strange enough that she wanted to be very sure before she put her name to them. Her name was Jimo Borjigin. She had come to the United States from Inner Mongolia as a graduate student in the 1990s, worked her way through a doctorate in molecular physiology, and eventually set up her own lab studying the neuroscience of very ordinary things: sleep, circadian rhythm, melatonin. Her work was respectable and unglamorous. She was not, at the beginning of this particular story, looking for anything dramatic. What had happened was this. Her lab ran EEG recordings on rats as a routine part of their sleep studies. One day, a postdoc in the lab mentioned, almost in passing, that when one of the animals had died on the recording apparatus, the trace had done something odd in the final minutes. Borjigin looked at the data. She asked to see more. They pulled the recordings from several animals that had died during experiments, natural deaths, cardiac events, not induced, and laid out the traces for the last half hour of each one. The pattern was the same in every case. After the heart stopped, the brain did something unexpected. Not flatline, not fade, a surge, a sudden synchronized burst of activity in the gamma range, the same high-frequency waves that, in a healthy awake brain, are associated with alert attention and conscious experience. The intensity of the burst in several of the rats was higher than anything recorded during ordinary wakefulness. It lasted for something like 30 seconds, and then gradually it subsided, and the trace went quiet for good. This was not what anyone expected the dying brain to do. The common sense picture, the one most textbooks offered, if they offered one at all, was that the brain, deprived of oxygen, would simply shut down in an orderly way, progressively losing function as the cells ran out of fuel. Activity would taper, the lights would dim, nothing would spike. But here was a spike, brief, intense, highly organized. Gamma is not the signature of a brain falling apart. Gamma is the signature of a brain doing something integrated and coherent, and the rats were doing it, apparently, a few seconds after they had died. Borjigin held onto the data for about a year, running controls, rerunning analyses, checking for artifacts. The kind of slow, careful verification a scientist does when she's worried the result is too good to be true. When she eventually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the paper was careful. It did not claim that the rats were having experiences as they died. It claimed, more narrowly, that the dying brain produced a signature of neural activity consistent with, in her words, heightened conscious processing. What this meant, if it meant anything, was left deliberately open. The paper got some attention. It was the kind of result that didn't fit anyone's prior picture, and people weren't quite sure what to do with it. Some neuroscientists were skeptical, wondering whether the gamma surge was an artifact of the specific way the rats had died, or a last chaotic gasp of neurons misfiring as they depolarized. Others thought it was genuinely interesting and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next, 10 years later, was that Borjigin got permission to do the same kind of recording on 4 human patients. These were patients in a neurological intensive care unit, all of them in deep coma, all of them, by the judgment of their medical teams and families, beyond the point of recovery. The families had agreed to the withdrawal of life support, which is a decision made in these units every day, and they had agreed, additionally, to allow continuous EEG recording during and after the withdrawal. The purpose of the recording was to see in a human brain whether the pattern Borjigin had seen in the rats showed up at all. In 2 of the 4 patients, it did. In the other 2, the trace went flat, as expected, in the orderly fade the textbooks predicted. But in 2, she and her team reported in a paper published in 2023, the removal of the ventilator was followed, a minute or 2 later, by a sudden rise in gamma activity concentrated in a specific region at the back of the brain, an area that neuroscientists had come to associate, in healthy subjects, with the integration of sensory experience and the sense of being a conscious observer of the world. Borjigin named this region the posterior cortical hot zone. The surge in her patients lasted longer than it had in the rats. In one case, almost 10 minutes. We do not know whether those two patients were, in any meaningful sense, experiencing anything. We cannot know that. The patients themselves did not survive to tell us. What we have is the trace, the record of the brain doing something highly organized in a specific region during a window when, by all our conventional measures, the brain should have been quiet. A second line of research has been running, more or less in parallel, over the same years. A British-born physician named Sam Parnia has spent most of his career trying to study what happens, from the inside, during cardiac arrest. He works at a hospital in New York. His research enrolls patients whose hearts have stopped and who have been successfully resuscitated, people who were, for some interval of minutes, clinically dead and who came back. His largest recent study, published in 2023, followed over 500 such patients across 25 medical centers. Most of them remembered nothing, some of them remembered fragments. A smaller number, roughly 1 in 5, reported something Parnia and his team now call a recalled experience of death. They had renamed the phenomenon from the older and more loaded term near-death experience because they wanted a name that stuck closer to what was actually being reported and didn't smuggle in any conclusions. The reports were varied. Some patients described a sense of detachment from their bodies, a kind of observer's view of the resuscitation in progress. Some described a review of significant moments from their lives. Some described a presence or a light or a particular feeling of being drawn toward something. A few, and this is the part that's hardest to explain, reported specific, verifiable details of what had happened in the room while their hearts were stopped, what the medical staff had said, what instruments had been used, details that were later confirmed by the teams who had worked on them. Parnia does not claim that any of this proves anything metaphysical. He is careful to say in his papers and in interviews that what the reports demonstrate is at minimum the capacity for organized conscious experience during a period when the brain, measured from outside, looked quiet. What that means, whether it's a feature of the dying brain we don't yet understand or something stranger, is a question he leaves open. He thinks it's worth taking seriously. He doesn't think he's proved anything about what comes after. A third figure worth mentioning, because his trajectory is perhaps the most interesting, is a neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, who spent most of his career as one of the leading exponents of what you might call the standard materialist picture of consciousness. Consciousness is what certain kinds of brain processes are like from the inside. When the processes stop, the consciousness stops. Full stop. Koch has been gradually and publicly becoming less sure. In a book he published in 2024, he argued that the standard picture has run into enough trouble that we may need to consider possibilities that most serious scientists have long dismissed. That consciousness might not be something the brain produces, but something the brain participates in. He is careful to call this speculation. He is not claiming to know. He is noting that after 40 years of looking for consciousness inside the brain, the looking has not gone as well as was hoped, and that the failure may be informative. This is contested. There are researchers in the field who think Koch has drifted into territory that isn't really science anymore, and they have said so. There is a serious scientific dispute, and it is not settled, and the people on both sides are intelligent and careful and looking at the same data. Here is what seems to be true if we stand back. Between the gamma surges and the recalled experiences and the slow migration of people like Koch toward positions they wouldn't have held a decade ago, something is shifting in how the brain-death interface is being thought about. Not in the sense that anyone has the answer, but in the sense that the old confidence is eroding. The confident materialist picture, the one that said we basically know how this works and it's just mechanics, has started to look less confident. The confident, non-materialist picture, the one that said consciousness must survive because it's clearly more than brain, has not been vindicated either. What we have, right now, is a set of results that don't fit neatly into either frame, and a lot of careful researchers trying to figure out what they mean. And here is where it becomes useful to pause for a moment, because a particular temptation shows up at exactly this point, and it is worth naming. The temptation is to take data like this and run with it, to say, so consciousness does persist, the mystics were right, the brain is just a receiver, the self goes on. This is a move that has been made in print many times over the last few decades, and every time it has been made, the researchers who generated the data have winced, because it's not what the data say. The data say there is activity in the dying brain that we did not expect and do not fully understand. That is a smaller and more interesting claim than the one people want to pull out of it. The opposite temptation is also worth naming. That one says, well, it's just neurons. Last chaotic firings doesn't mean anything. The brain dies, you die. This too is a move made confidently, and it is also a step further than the data support. It assumes we already know what gamma coherence in a dying brain implies for subjective experience, and we don't. The honest position in 2026 sits in between. There is a real finding. Its interpretation is genuinely open. People who claim to know in either direction are telling you more than the evidence does. This is not a dramatic place to stand. It doesn't make for good headlines. But it is where the careful people are standing. And it's worth learning to stand there too, at least for a while, because something about the question, about this whole question, seems to reward patience. So the picture, such as we have it, looks like this. Epicurus, in his garden, was arguing that death is the end of sensation and therefore nothing to fear. He argued this from reason and from his picture of the world. 23 centuries later, with actual electrodes attached to actual dying brains, we can say that his picture is partially confirmed. The brain does eventually stop. The signature does eventually fade. We can also say that something unexpected happens in the interval between the heart stopping and the signal going dark. What that something is, and whether it is in any way relevant to what Epicurus was talking about, we do not yet know. He would have found this interesting. He believed in looking at the evidence. He would have asked for the data. He might have been delighted to find he was mostly right. He might have been surprised to find something still to argue about. The thing that pulls at me, watching this from here, is that the old question, the one Socrates and Epicurus argued about from opposite ends of the same small city, turns out to be a question we cannot quite settle from the outside. You can get the EEG, you can get the report from the patient who came back. What you cannot get is the view from inside the brain at the moment the gamma lights up, which is the only view that would actually answer the question, and which is the one view no instrument is ever going to reach. A few decades before Borjigin ran her first rat, a man in Germany had worked out, without any EEG, without any patient reports, just by thinking very carefully about what kind of thing a human life is. A theory of death that didn't depend on any of this. His theory said that the question we kept trying to answer from outside was the wrong question to begin with, and that we'd been missing something obvious about where death actually lives in a human life. In the early 1920s, in a university town in the south of Germany, a philosopher in his 30s was giving a morning seminar on Aristotle when a student asked him at the end of the session how one ought to live. The philosopher, his name was Martin Heidegger, thought about it for a moment, and then gave an answer that the student wrote down afterward because it didn't sound like any answer he had expected. "Spend more time in cemeteries," Heidegger said. He wasn't joking. He wasn't being morbid either, though it took the student a while to see that. He was pointing at something specific, and over the next few years in a book called Being and Time, he would try to lay out what the something was. The book appeared in 1927, and it changed philosophy in ways that are still being absorbed. Most of it is dense, difficult in the way German philosophy tends to be difficult, full of invented words and long sentences that seem to be doing at least 3 things at once. But the section on death, buried a few hundred pages in, is one of the clearest things Heidegger ever wrote, and it makes an argument that has been impossible to quite shake, even for people who don't buy the rest of his system. His argument is not about what happens after death. He has very little to say about that. His argument is about what death is, for the person who will die while they are still alive, which, he points out, is every one of us, every day, right now. Here is the move he makes. which is strange enough to need a few run-ups to see. Most of the time, when we think about death at all, we think about it as an event that lies somewhere ahead of us in time. An appointment on a calendar whose date is unknown but whose reality we accept. It's out there, in the future, and we're here, in the present, and there is a long corridor between us. On this picture, being alive is this side of the corridor, and death is what happens when we reach the other end. Heidegger says this picture is wrong, not factually wrong exactly, but wrong in a deeper way, wrong about what kind of relation death actually has to a life. Death is not an event ahead of you. Death is a structural feature of what it means to be alive in the first place. Consider, he says, how you actually experience time. You're not just sitting in a row of moments, passively receiving them one after another. You are always, in every moment, projected forward, leaning into what's coming, planning, expecting, worrying, anticipating. The present is never just the present. It's always shot through with an orientation towards something that hasn't happened yet. This is so basic to how consciousness works that we don't notice it. It's like the transparent medium in which everything else takes place. And the farthest edge of that leaning forward, the limit of everything you anticipate, the thing that gives the shape of your anticipating its boundary, is your own death. Not as an event that will one day arrive, but as the fact that anticipation has an end. Every plan you make, every project you undertake, every conversation you look forward to, all of it is shaped silently by the fact that there is a final horizon beyond which no more plans will be made. Your life has a terminus, and that terminus is not far off in some other territory. It's a feature of every moment that's happening right now. This is the first thing he wants us to see. Death is not somewhere else. Death is the shape of what it's like to be alive and oriented toward a future. Remove the terminus and you don't get a longer life. You get something that isn't a life at all, because a life is the kind of thing that has an ending. And the ending isn't an unfortunate add-on. The ending is part of the structure. The second thing he wants us to see is harder, and it's the thing the student had probably been asking about when he got the cemetery answer. Heidegger says that most of us, most of the time, live in a particular relation to this fact about ourselves, and the relation is one of quiet avoidance. We know we're mortal, we don't exactly deny it, but we handle the knowledge at a comfortable distance by packaging it in a specific kind of language. We say things like one dies eventually, or everyone has their time, or death comes for all of us. You can feel the grammar of it, how the sentences locate the fact somewhere vague, somewhere collective, somewhere that isn't quite the particular person speaking. The dying in these sentences is always being done by a generalized one, never by a specific me. He has a phrase for this voice. He calls it das Man, which in German means something like the they or the one, the anonymous impersonal speaker we all become when we're talking in the register of common sense. Das Man is not a particular person. It's the voice of the crowd, the default mode of speech we slip into when we don't have anything more specific to say. And Das Man has a special relationship to death. Das Man says, death is something that happens. But when you listen to what Das Man actually means, underneath the words, the meaning is almost the opposite. When one dies, what's really being said is that nobody dies, because one is everybody in general, and therefore nobody in particular. The particular speaker, the person using the phrase, remains, quietly, the exception. This is what Tolstoy had noticed about Ivan Ilyich lying in his bed, running the syllogism and finding it somehow didn't reach him. Heidegger, without having read Tolstoy, was identifying the same machinery from the other side. The syllogism works on Caesar because Caesar is one. It fails on Vanya because Vanya is me. The grammar that lets us talk about death comfortably is the grammar of the first case, and it's a grammar most of us live inside almost all the time because living inside it is what makes ordinary life feel ordinary. If you really held the second version, I specifically am going to end, held it continuously, at full volume, you would not be able to pick curtains, you would barely be able to get out of bed. Heidegger's term for the condition of living inside the comfortable grammar was inauthentic existence. He didn't mean it as an insult. He wasn't saying the people who live this way are fakes or cowards or failures. He was saying that it's the default, and the default is how society holds together, and nobody should be ashamed of it. What he was saying is that there is another mode available, and the other mode is what his book is trying to describe. And the other mode is the one the student had been asking about when he got the cemetery answer. The other mode has a name too. Heidegger calls it authentic being toward death. The phrase is a mouthful, but the idea underneath is simple. Live with the fact that it's you, not one, but you specifically, this person breathing now, who is going to die, and don't keep translating this back into the safer grammar every time it comes up. Hold it in the first person, not constantly, not obsessively, not in a way that paralyzes you, but not in the way Das Man holds it either, which is to say at arm's length through the veil of the generality. Why would you do this? Not for moral reasons, not because it makes you a better person. Heidegger's claim is more radical and more interesting. He says that living inside the comfortable grammar means living someone else's life. Your choices aren't really yours, they're one's choices. The choices one makes in your circumstances. The choices available to the kind of person you happen to look like from outside. You take the job one takes. You date the person one dates. You spend your evenings the way one spends them. All of this feels like your life from inside, but it isn't, quite. It's a life-shaped thing that you're wearing. The thing that breaks this spell, he says, is a genuine encounter with your own finitude. Not the generalized knowledge that one dies, but the particular recognition that you do. When that recognition lands, and it can land in ordinary moments, not just in hospital rooms, something shifts. You suddenly notice that the time available to you is finite, and not finite in some abstract way, but finite in a particular way, with a particular number of mornings in it, and the mornings are being spent. And in that moment, the question of what to actually do with them becomes, possibly for the first time, a question you are asking, not one asking, you. This is the cemetery answer, explained. Spending time around the fact of death, not morbidly, not performatively, but seriously, is a way of breaking the grammar of avoidance, and that broken grammar is, on his view, the precondition for anything resembling a real choice about how to live. It's not a gloomy program, it's meant to be a kind of freedom. There are reasons to resist this, and some of them are worth taking seriously, because Heidegger himself turns out to be a complicated case. One objection is that his picture is unreasonably individualistic. Death, on his account, is the ultimate private possession, the thing no one else can do for you, the thing that radically isolates you in the moment of facing it. But this is not actually how most human beings die. Most deaths happen in the presence of other people. Most deaths are held in their final hours by families and nurses and friends and strangers who are paid to be kind. A philosophy that describes the dying person as essentially alone, essentially cut off in their own most non-relational absolute finitude, to use his words, may be missing what is most obviously true about how death actually unfolds in the life of a human animal. There's a Scottish theologian, writing in the late 1990s, who made this objection very sharply. He pointed out that the appropriate response to knowing you're about to die for most people in most times and places has been to call for company, to reach for another hand, to ask someone to stay, to have the comfort of another person's breathing in the room. This is not a failure of authenticity. It's what we are as creatures. Heidegger's lone, resolute Dasein, staring down its finitude in perfect isolation, may be a picture of how a certain kind of philosopher would like to die, not a picture of how human beings die. The second objection is more troubling, and there is no way to address this chapter honestly without raising it. In 1933, 6 years after publishing Being and Time, Heidegger became rector of the University of Freiburg and joined the National Socialist Party. He kept the rectorship for less than a year, and afterward his relationship to the party became complicated and evasive. But he never, in the rest of his life, he lived until 1976, offered a clear account of what he had done or what he had believed in those years, or what he thought he owed to the people the party had killed. His published notebooks, released after his death, contain anti-Semitic passages that are difficult to reconcile with any charitable reading. This matters for reading Being and Time. Not because the philosophy is a coded defense of anything Heidegger later did, it isn't, but because a book about authentic existence, written by a man who later failed his own test about as completely as a philosopher can fail it, has to be read with that failure in mind. The ideas are still interesting. The argument about death still bites. But the man who made the argument did not live his way into the clarity he claimed his argument offered, and that fact is part of what we have to carry when we read him. None of which changes what he got right, which is the thing about the grammar. There really are two ways of holding the knowledge that you will die. One of them keeps the knowledge at the level of one, where it can't touch the person doing the thinking. The other one brings it down to the particular body that is thinking it, with the particular morning it is having, with the specific number of breaths it has left, which is a number no one knows but which exists. The first way is easier. The second way is, on his account and maybe on honest reflection, closer to being actually alive. Whether he was right that this is the precondition for freedom, or whether he was making a philosophical mistake dressed up in serious prose, is a question worth sitting with. But the basic observation that there are two registers of mortal self-knowledge and that we mostly live in the easier one is hard to dismiss once you've heard it. It stays with you, the way a phrase from a letter sometimes stays with you, and you catch yourself using the comfortable grammar and noticing now that you're using it. Around the same time Heidegger was writing in Germany, 3,000 miles east and 2,500 years earlier, a young prince had stood on a battlefield in northern India and refused to pick up his bow. He had looked across at the army he was supposed to fight, his cousins, his teachers, men he had known all his life, and something in him had simply stopped, and the figure standing next to him, holding the reins of his chariot, had started to speak. The battlefield is called Kurukshetra, and it lies on a flat plain about 100 miles north of what is now Delhi. The scene, as the Bhagavad Gita preserves it, happens in a single morning in the last hour before the armies close. Two enormous hosts are drawn up facing each other across the plain, and between them, in the no man's land that will in a few minutes no longer exist, a chariot has stopped. The archer in the chariot is Arjuna, a prince of the Pandava line, one of the great warriors of the age. The driver, holding the reins, is his friend Krishna, who has come along as his charioteer, a humble role by ordinary standards for the figure who is, in the theology of the text, an incarnation of the divine. Arjuna has asked Krishna to pull him up between the armies so he can look at who he is about to fight. Krishna has obliged, and what Arjuna sees, when he looks, is not what a soldier is supposed to see. He sees faces he knows, cousins, uncles, the grandfather who taught him to shoot, the teacher who gave him his first bow, men he has loved on the other side, holding weapons they mean to use, and something in him gives way. He sets down his bow. He tells Krishna that he cannot do this, that whatever victory he would win by fighting would be bought at the price of everything that had ever made victory worth wanting. This is the opening situation of a text that would, over the next 2,000 years, become one of the most closely read works of religious philosophy anywhere on earth. Most of the Gita is Krishna's long response to that moment. Arjuna, sitting down in the chariot, bow at his feet, refusing to fight. What Krishna says, over the course of the conversation, reaches into territory very far from the immediate question of battle. But the passages that matter for the question we are following come early in the second chapter of the text, and they are among the most direct statements on what death is or isn't in the whole of world literature. Krishna's first move is to tell Arjuna that he is grieving for something that cannot be lost. The bodies you see across the field, he says, will die, certainly. The ones in this chariot will die. The ones riding on horseback over there will die. That is what bodies do. But the thing you are actually fighting for, or against, or mourning, is not the body. The real thing, the self that is doing the seeing from behind your eyes right now, was never born in the way bodies are born, and it will not die in the way bodies die. It wasn't produced when your body was assembled, and it will not be destroyed when your body is undone. It is older than your body. It will outlast it. He puts this in a verse that has been recited in Sanskrit for more than 2,000 years, and that has lost very little of its force in translation. This self, he says, is not born, nor does it die. It did not come to be in the past, and it will not cease to be in the future. Unborn, eternal, enduring, ancient. It is not slain when the body is slain. The image he uses a few verses later to make the point concrete is one that every listener can follow. When your clothes grow old, he says, you take them off and put on new ones. You do not mistake the clothes for yourself. You know the wearer is not the garment. In the same way, when the body grows old, whether at 80 or at 20, whether from disease or from a sword on this field, the self that has been wearing it simply lays it aside and takes on another. The garment is not the wearer is something else. This is a very different picture from the one we have been sitting with. Epicurus thought the self was an arrangement of atoms that dissolved when the body stopped. Heidegger thought the self was bound to its own finitude in a way that made the finitude part of what the self was. The Gita is saying something that contradicts both. The self is not an arrangement. It is not bound to its finite body. It is the kind of thing that passes through bodies, temporarily tenanting them, and then moves on. Where does it come from, and where does it go? The Upanishads, which are the older philosophical texts that lie underneath the Gita, the composted ground the Gita grows out of, have an answer to this, though it's an answer that takes a certain amount of getting used to. The answer is that the self that watches from behind your eyes is not yourself in the way you usually think. It is not Vanya or Ivan or anyone with a name. It is something more basic than that. The individual you, the person who woke up this morning with a particular set of memories and preferences, is like a wave on the surface of an ocean. The wave is real. It has a shape. It moves. It can be pointed to. But the wave is not something separate from the water. It's a temporary form the water is making. And when the wave subsides, nothing substantial is lost. The water is still there. The water was always what the wave was, underneath its shape. The ocean, in this image, is what the Upanishads call Brahman, not a god in the Western sense, but the underlying reality that all individual selves are forms of, and the wave is what they call Atman, the self. The great discovery the Upanishads want to hand to their reader is that these two are not different. Tat tavam asi, one of the most famous phrases in the tradition, that the ocean is what you are, not what you have, what you are. If you take this seriously, the question we have been asking gets a strange answer. What happens after you die? The wave falls back into the ocean. The form that was temporarily held is no longer held, but you, in the deepest sense of you, were never the wave to begin with. You were always the water. So nothing, in the sense that matters, has happened. Nothing could happen. The wave was a shape that water was briefly making, and now the water is making other shapes somewhere else on the surface, and the thing you actually were is undiminished. This is either a very consoling picture or a kind of sleight of hand, depending on what you bring to it. If you can hear it the way it was meant to be heard, as a claim that the particular self you have been identifying with was always a kind of local weather, and the weather passing is not the loss of the sky, then death becomes a different kind of event. It isn't the end of you, it's the end of a temporary shape you had been mistaking for you. If you cannot hear it that way, then it sounds like a bait and switch. You don't survive. Some cosmic impersonal, it survives. And from the perspective of Vanya, who liked his particular perfume, and his particular wife, and his particular Tuesday afternoons, it's cold comfort to be told that the water of the world continues unaffected. Both reactions have been common in India as elsewhere for a very long time. The tradition itself has not been monolithic about this. There is a strand, associated most famously with a medieval philosopher named Shankara, that takes the strong reading. The individual self is, at its deepest level, simply identical with the ocean, and the appearance of separate selves is a kind of illusion that liberation dispels. There is another strand, associated with a philosopher named Madhva a few centuries later, that reads the same texts very differently. Yes, there is a supreme reality, but individual selves are genuinely distinct from it, eternally so, and the relationship between them is something like devotion rather than identity. There are strands in between. The Gita is rich enough and ambiguous enough that it has supported all of them. This is worth knowing, because the common Western shorthand, Hinduism, teaches that we are all one, compresses centuries of careful internal disagreement into a slogan, and the slogan doesn't do justice to what any of the actual thinkers were saying. What is common to all the readings, though, is the part about the wearer and the garment. The body goes. The self, in whatever precise sense of self the particular school is defending, does not. And the appropriate response to death is therefore something other than terror. You can grieve. You can miss the person. Krishna does not tell Arjuna that his feelings are mistaken. He tells him that his feelings are misdirected. The grief is real. It's just that the grief is for the garment and the wearer is fine. Arjuna, in the text, listens to this and is not immediately convinced. He asks more questions. Krishna keeps talking for 17 more chapters as it happens. But the opening move, the one that matters for what we are tracking, is the one he makes in that second chapter. The self that is the real subject of your life is not the kind of thing that dies. You can hold this up against what Heidegger was saying and see that they cannot both be right, not really. Heidegger's whole analysis depended on the terminus being real, being, in his phrase, the ownmost possibility that could not be outstripped. Krishna is saying the terminus is a feature of the garment, not the wearer, and the wearer was never subject to the terminus in the first place. If Heidegger is right, the Gita is consoling people with a fiction. If the Gita is right, Heidegger has been looking at the wave and mistaking it for the ocean. There is no way to settle this from the outside. You can read the arguments on both sides. You can notice which one you find more natural, which one your body seems to assume when you're not being careful. Most people, if they are honest, will find that some part of them is a Heideggerian, feeling the finitude as real, as personal, as not to be talked around. And some part of them is something like a Vedantine, feeling in certain moments that the particular person they are is a shape rather than a substance, and that the shape's ending is not the end of whatever was making the shape. These two reactions can coexist in the same mind, in the same hour, without either one ever quite winning. That is one of the odder features of being the kind of creature that has to think about this at all. Not long after the Gita was taking its classical shape, within a few centuries, in the same civilizational world, another conversation about the self was going on, and it reached a conclusion that was very different and in some ways more radical than anything Krishna had said to Arjuna. The question it asked was not whether the self survives the body. The question was whether the self, in the sense we usually mean, was ever really there to begin with. Around the middle of the 2nd century before our era, in a kingdom tucked between the Hindu Kush and the Indus, a place that had been left behind by Alexander's armies and was being governed at the time of this story by a Greek king with a Sanskrit name, a conversation took place that was written down a little later and has survived in fragments ever since. The king was called Menander in Greek and Milinda in the Pali of the Buddhist texts that preserved him. He was a cultured man, curious about religion, fluent in at least 2 languages, and he had a habit, apparently, of summoning the wisest people in his kingdom to his court to test their thinking. One of the people he summoned was a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. What Melinda wanted to know, and what a lot of people had wanted to know about the Buddhist teachers for a couple of centuries by that point, was how to make sense of something the Buddhists kept saying. The something was this: there is no self. The monks would say it calmly, as though it were a statement about the weather. The rest of the world would hear it and be baffled, because of course there was a self. You could see it walking around. You could see Nagasena, specifically, walking into the audience chamber, sitting down, preparing to answer questions. That was a self. What could it possibly mean to say there wasn't one? Melinda put the question directly. "If there is no self," he said, "then who is it that I am talking to? Who walked in here just now? Who is going to walk out?" Nagasena did not give a direct argument. He gave, instead, one of the best remembered replies in the whole history of philosophy. He asked the king a different question. "How did you get here today, Your Majesty?" "By chariot," Melinda said. "Show me the chariot," Nagasena said. The king, who had not expected this turn, said the chariot was outside, waiting. "No," Nagasena said. "Show me the chariot itself. The thing you came in. Is it the wheels?" "No," said Melinda. "The wheels are not the chariot. Is it the axle?" "Not the axle either. The yoke, the reins, the frame, the seat." One by one, Nagasena went through the parts. Melinda admitted each time that the part in question was not the chariot. A wheel is a wheel, an axle is an axle. None of them, taken individually, is what he came in. "So," Nagasena said, "what is the chariot? If it is not any of the parts, where is it?" Melinda paused. Then he gave the answer the monk had been waiting for. "The chariot is not any single one of these things," he said. "The chariot is the arrangement of these things together, the way they are assembled, the fact that they move together as a unit and can carry a person. The chariot is the parts functioning as parts of a chariot. There is no separate chariot stuff, no chariot essence hiding behind the pieces. Chariot is a word we use for the whole when the parts are arranged in a certain way." "Just so," Nagasena said. "And that is what I mean when I say there is no self. Nagasena," he was explaining, "is not something over and above the arrangement of a body, some sensations, some perceptions, some habits and tendencies, and a stream of awareness that moves through them. There are all of those things. They are real, they are right now arranged in a particular way that happens to be walking and talking, but there is no Nagasena essence behind them, no separate owner who has these experiences the way a person has a horse. The arrangement, functioning as an arrangement, is what we call Nagasena. Take the arrangement apart and nothing is left over, not because Nagasena was destroyed, but because there was never anything there beyond the arrangement in the first place. This is a move that sounds at first like semantic sleight of hand, and people have been accusing it of being exactly that for 2,000 years. But if you sit with it for a minute, something odd happens, because you can try to find your own chariot stuff. You can close your eyes and look for the part of you that is having the experiences, the observer behind the observing, the I that is reading these words rather than the words being read or the eyes that are reading them. And what you tend to find, if you look honestly, is what Nagasena is pointing at. You find experiences, you find thoughts about the experiences, you find a sense of being someone, a kind of familiar weather that follows you around, but you don't quite find the someone. There's a feeling of being, but when you reach for the being, what you come up with is more feeling. 1800 years later, a Scottish philosopher named David Hume, sitting in Edinburgh and writing a book about human nature, produced almost the same observation. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he wrote, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. He had not read Nagasena. He probably hadn't heard of Nagasena. He was just looking, and he found what Nagasena had found. What the Buddhists built out of this observation, though, went further than what Hume did with it. Hume was content to notice that we can't catch the self in the act, and to be honest about that, and move on. The Buddhists thought the observation pointed to something more consequential, that the self we take ourselves to be is, in a certain way, a fiction. Not a malicious fiction, a convenient one. A habit of perception that lets us function, the way assuming the chariot is a thing lets us speak about transportation without having to say the arrangement of parts I rode here in every time. But it is a habit, and like any habit, it can be noticed, and seeing it as a habit changes your relationship to it. Where this gets interesting is when you turn the same lens on death. If there is no chariot beyond the arrangement, then when the chariot breaks down, nothing goes anywhere. There is no chariot soul that leaves, heading off to the great garage in the sky. The parts fall apart, and that's that. So, you might think, the Buddhist view ought to be just about the same as Epicurus's. Bodies dissolve, arrangements scatter, nothing survives. But that is not what the Buddhist tradition actually teaches. And the reason why is one of the more delicate pieces of philosophy anyone has ever tried to hold. The tradition teaches rebirth. Something goes on. A new life starts, shaped by what was in the old one, carrying forward somehow the momentum of the decisions and the qualities of the mind that had been building up. Karma, the system most people have heard of in a cartoon version. But, and this is the move, what goes on is not you. It was never you in the first place because there was no chariot. There was an arrangement, and the arrangement had tendencies. And when the arrangement comes apart, the tendencies carry forward into a new arrangement that is shaped by them. The new arrangement is not the same as the old one. It does not remember being the old one. It is not even, in any meaningful sense, its continuation, but it is influenced by what the old arrangement was doing. Nagasena has an image for this too. Imagine, he says, a flame in a lamp that burns through the night. The flame at dawn is not the flame at dusk. The flame is never the same flame for 2 consecutive moments. It's a process, renewing itself from its fuel, producing itself again and again. You would not say that the dawn flame is a different flame from the dusk flame. You would not say it is the same either. Not the same and not another. There's a phrase in the Pali texts that gets used for this relationship, which is the same phrase that describes the connection between one life and the next. If you light a second lamp from the first and then blow out the first, the second lamp is now burning. Is that the same flame that was burning in the first lamp? In a sense, yes. There's a continuity, a transfer. In another sense, no. They're different flames, separate now, each with its own future. The question is, if the same flame turns out to be the wrong question. The flame was never the kind of thing that was one or not one. It was always a pattern, and patterns can pass from one substrate to another without being either identical or separate. This is what the tradition is saying happens at death. Not nothing, but also not the persistence of a person. A pattern moves. What it moves into is a new arrangement, a new body, a new setting. That new arrangement will have its own chariot, its own functional identity, its own sense of being someone. It will not know it came from anywhere. It will not remember the old arrangement. The old arrangement, in any sense that matters to Vanya or Ivan, will simply be over. You can hear this as bleak or as consoling, depending on what you bring. Bleak, because you don't survive in any sense you'd recognize as survival. Consoling, because nothing of what mattered about you is being wasted or lost. The patterns you built, the habits you reinforced, the qualities of attention you cultivated, all of that leaves its mark on what comes next. even if the next thing has no memory of you. Either way, it is a strange middle position between the picture that says you go to heaven and the picture that says you are annihilated. It denies both. It says there was never a you that could go and never a you that could be annihilated. And also, and this is the part that keeps people coming back to it, that there is still something that carries on, just not what you'd been assuming. Arjuna's charioteer on the field at Kurukshetra would have disagreed with almost all of this. For Krishna, there is an Atman, and the Atman is eternal, and the eternal Atman is what carries through the bodies. For Nagasena, there is no Atman. There are only patterns, and the patterns don't need an owner to propagate. Both of them were answering the same question. They were looking at what happens when a body stops and a person is no longer there. And they came back with pictures that cannot both be true, formed within a few centuries of each other on roughly the same continent, using roughly the same vocabulary of rebirth and liberation and the end of suffering. The tradition has, naturally, argued about this ever since. There were Buddhist philosophers who refined the no-self position for 1,000 years, and Hindu philosophers who refined the eternal self position for just as long, and neither side converted the other. The disagreement is, in some sense, at the root of the philosophical traditions of South and East Asia, and it is not, despite the Western habit of collapsing both into some vague, mystical gestalt, a small or merely verbal disagreement. One tradition is saying you are the ocean. The other is saying there is no ocean and there is no you. There are only currents. These are different pictures of what the world is. What is common to them, though, and what separates both from the Epicurean picture, is the refusal to treat death as a simple stopping. In both views, something continues, even if what continues is, in the Buddhist case, almost unrecognizable as continuation. Neither tradition treats the body as the whole story. Neither treats its just neurons as the final word. And both, incidentally, were building these pictures without any access to the inside of a skull, which makes it interesting that something not entirely unrelated to what they were saying, the image of currents that can propagate without a stable owner, the idea that what we call a self is more a pattern than a substance, has been echoing faintly inside the skulls that the Epicurean tradition eventually got around to looking at. None of the ancient schools predicted what Borjigin would find, but one of them, arguably, had the right shape of vocabulary ready for it. Whether that means anything is itself a question. Similar pictures produced by very different methods is either convergent evidence or coincidence, and deciding which is the kind of judgment call no method settles for you. Somewhere between these two answers, between the eternal self that cannot die and the flowing pattern that was never anything to die in the first place, a third tradition took root in a region further north, in the mountains of Tibet. What it did with the question is neither of the first two things exactly. It made death into a practice. Sometime in the 8th century, in a region that is now the border between Tibet and Bhutan, a man from a distant valley in what is now northern Pakistan arrived on the plateau and began teaching. His Sanskrit name was Padmasambhava. The Tibetans called him Guru Rinpoche, the precious master. He had been invited by the king of Tibet to help establish Buddhism in a land where older shamanic traditions still held the ground, and the stories about what he did there over the next few years vary wildly depending on who is telling them. He founded monasteries, he subdued local spirits, he taught a particular lineage of practice that would much later be called the Nyingma school, and, among many other things, he dictated a set of teachings that he believed were not quite for his own time. The teachings were, on their face, instructions for the moments around death. But Padmasambhava seems to have understood that the people listening to him in the 8th century were not the audience the teachings were meant for. The audience was in the future. The people who would need them hadn't been born yet. And so, according to the tradition, he gave the teachings to his closest student, a Tibetan noblewoman named Yeshe Tsogyal, who was by all accounts a formidable practitioner in her own right, and asked her to hide them. She hid them in the hills of central Tibet in ways the tradition describes variously, in rock, in water, in the minds of people who would be reborn to find them, in the air itself in certain places. The mechanics of this are not obvious to a reader unfamiliar with the tradition, and the tradition is not particularly interested in explaining them in terms a skeptic would accept. What matters, for our purposes, is that the teachings went underground and they stayed there for about 600 years. In the 14th century, a man named Karma Lingpa found them. He was what the tradition calls a terton, a discoverer of hidden teachings, a figure whose role within Tibetan Buddhism is to bring back to circulation the practices that had been waiting for their moment. What he brought back was a cycle of texts that we, in English, now call the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That title, as it happens, is wrong. It was invented in 1927 by a theosophist named Walter Evans Wentz, who had commissioned an English translation from a Tibetan scholar and wanted a title that would catch on. He picked the Tibetan Book of the Dead because he had been impressed by the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was popular in occult circles at the time, and he thought the parallel would be commercially helpful. It was. The book became a bestseller in ways almost no serious Buddhist text ever had, but the parallel was misleading, and the title has been quietly embarrassing the tradition ever since. The actual name of the text, Bardo Thodol, translates as something more like liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. It is not primarily a book about the dead, it is a book to be read to the dead, or more precisely, read in their presence in the days after breathing has stopped, because the tradition believes that something of what a person was remains available to guidance for a while after the body has given up. The book is a set of instructions spoken into that window. What you are about to experience, what these experiences will feel like, how not to panic, where to place your attention, what the options are. But the stranger and more interesting thing about the book is that it is not really for dead people. It is for the living, studied in advance, rehearsed in life, so that the person doing the dying will have already been through the descriptions 100 times and will recognize the terrain when they reach it. The book is a travel guide to a country you have not yet visited, which you are going to visit, and which, if you arrive unprepared, may overwhelm you in ways that will shape what happens next. So it is a practice. That is the key thing about it that distinguishes it from the other traditions we have been looking at. Epicurus gave you an argument. Krishna gave you a picture of what you really are. Nagasena gave you a diagnosis of a grammatical mistake. The Bardo Thodol gives you a curriculum. Here is what dying is like, it says. Here is the first thing you will notice. Here is the second thing. Here are the mistakes people make at this stage. Here is what to do instead. Study this. Rehearse this. Do not arrive as a tourist. What the book actually describes in the version Karma Lingpa brought back is a sequence of transitional states, bardos in Tibetan. There are 3 of them that matter for dying, and they are held inside a larger scheme of 6 bardos that covers the whole of experience, life and death together. The life ones include the bardo of ordinary waking consciousness, the bardo of dream, and the bardo of meditative absorption. The death ones include the bardo of the moment of dying itself, the bardo of what the tradition calls the experiencing of reality, and the bardo of becoming, the period in which a new life is being assembled out of the dispositions of the old one. The word bardo just means between or intermediate state. What it names is not a place so much as a kind of suspension, a moment where one state has stopped and the next hasn't quite started. The tradition's real teaching, the one you hear most often from contemporary Tibetan teachers, is that every moment is a bardo of some kind. Waking up is a bardo. Falling asleep is a bardo. The pause between one thought and the next is a bardo. Life itself is a bardo between the birth you don't remember and the death you haven't reached. The extended emphasis on the dying bardos in this view is partly because they are the ones people will face whether they want to or not, and it is easier to notice a bardo when everything else is falling away. But the texture of experience is bardos all the way down. What happens then in the first of the dying bardos? The Bardo Thodol says, at the moment of death, if the dying person's attention is in the right place, they will experience what the tradition calls the clear light. This is not, in any obvious way, a metaphor. The text describes it as an experience of primordial luminosity, of the ground of awareness itself uncovered, unfiltered by the ordinary self-concern that usually obscures it. The instruction, if you are reading to the dying person, is to tell them, this light is not something foreign. This light is not something coming to get you. This light is what you have always been, underneath the daily noise. Recognize it. Rest in it. If you can do this even for a moment, something opens that does not close again. Most people, the tradition says, cannot do this. The habits of self-protection are too strong. The clear light appears and is missed, mistaken for something frightening or simply not noticed at all. The consciousness then passes into the second bardo, the one the text spends the most time on, in which a series of images and presences appear, some peaceful, some wrathful, some beautiful, some terrifying. These are variously described in different commentaries as objective entities, as projections of the dying mind, as archetypal patterns, or as, in some sense, all three. The instruction at every stage is the same. Whatever appears, do not identify with it, do not flee from it, do not grasp at it. Recognize it as a display of your own mind. Rest. If this also fails, and the tradition is realistic about how often it does, the consciousness passes into the third dying bardo, the bardo of becoming, in which the conditions for a next life begin to crystallize. The traditional texts describe this in vivid, sometimes disturbing detail. The person, still in some sense aware, is drawn toward scenes that reflect their own tendencies, and eventually, somewhere in the scenes, they find the situation into which they will be born. The whole process is said to take about 49 days. What do we do with all of this? It is tempting, coming from the philosophical traditions we have been following, to dismiss the Bardo Thodol as a charming ethnography, a local, culturally specific set of fantasies dressed up in serious prose. Some readers have taken this view, but the tradition itself would point out, reasonably, that we have not yet demonstrated that the culturally specific picture is wrong. The Bardo Thodol is a claim made by people who had spent their lives studying the mind more attentively than most of us ever will, about what can be encountered in certain states of consciousness. It may be right, it may be wrong, it may be pointing at real territory in a metaphorical vocabulary that doesn't travel well. None of these is obvious from outside. A psychiatrist from Zurich named Carl Jung read the Evans-Wentz edition when it came out and was struck by it in a very specific way. He thought the Bardo Thodol was describing, in religious language, a landscape he had been mapping in his clinical work in European patients, a landscape of unconscious contents that could be encountered in dreams, in certain altered states, and, he suspected, at the moment of death. He wrote a commentary that was included in later editions. His commentary is careful. He does not claim that the bardos are real in a metaphysical sense. He claims that whatever they are not purely invented because they line up too precisely with structures he had seen rising in the psyches of people who had never heard of Tibet. This is a different kind of endorsement than a believer's, but it is not nothing. The reason the Bardo Thodol matters for the question we have been following is this. We have been looking in previous voices at what death is, an event, a structure, a garment change, the dissolution of a pattern. Most of these pictures leave the person facing the question with nothing particular to do. Epicurus says, "Stop being afraid, you'll be fine." Heidegger says, "Take it seriously and your life will cohere." The Gita says, "Recognize that you are not the body." Nagasena says, "There was never a you to worry about." The Bardo Thodol is the only one of these that treats the question as an occasion for training. You are going to die. Certain things will happen when you do. Some of those things will be easier to meet if you have practiced meeting them in advance in small ways while you are still here. The daily bardos, waking up, falling asleep, the pause between thoughts, are described as rehearsals, not because they are fun to think about, but because what you do in them is, in some sense, what you will do in the one that doesn't reverse. This is worth putting beside the other traditions. It is not a competing metaphysics. It is a training manual. Whether the metaphysics it implies is true, the training may still be valuable. A person who has spent decades practicing a certain kind of relaxed attention at the edge of sleep may, in fact, be better prepared for whatever comes when the preparations run out than a person who has never noticed that the edge of sleep is a place at all. That is an empirical claim in a sense, though not the kind empirical work tends to investigate. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Yeshe Tsogyal on a mountain, putting a manuscript into the rock. She cannot have known for certain that it would be found. She was operating on trust, that the moment for the teaching would come, that a person capable of recognizing it would appear, that what was handed to her would travel through 600 years of weather and silence and arrive more or less intact in a hand that could use it. It is hard to know what she thought she was doing exactly, but if you are asked, as most of us eventually are asked, what to do with the knowledge that one day the ordinary grammar of your life will break, one answer is to do what she did. Put something down, trust that it might be found, let it go. In 1984, a philosopher at All Souls College, Oxford, published a book that had taken him about 15 years to finish. It was a long book. It argued, among other things, that almost everything ordinary people believed about personal identity was wrong, and that once you noticed this, the way you felt about your own death changed, not, he thought, for the worse. The philosopher's name was Derek Parfit. He was, by most accounts, a strange man, brilliant, generous with his time, exacting about ideas, reportedly capable of going for a year without noticing what he was wearing. The book was called Reasons and Persons, and the section of it that people keep returning to is built around a thought experiment he called the teleporter case. He was not the first person to imagine such a thing. Science fiction had been playing with the image for decades, but he was the first person to use it the way he did, as a scalpel for a very particular philosophical question. Here is the setup, roughly as he presents it. Imagine that humans have developed a way to travel to other planets without the long inconvenience of actually moving through space. You step into a booth on Earth. A scanner records the exact state of every cell in your body, down to the arrangement of the molecules. That information is transmitted, at the speed of light, to a receiving station on, say, Mars. On Mars, out of the local atoms, a perfect copy of you is assembled. Same body, same brain, same memories, same personality, same tendency to hum while making coffee. Meanwhile, the original, the body that stepped into the booth on Earth, is destroyed, painlessly, instantly. The whole process takes a few minutes. The person who walks out of the booth on Mars remembers stepping in on Earth. They feel continuous with the person who stepped in. They have all the memories, all the plans, all the habits. They pick up where they left off. The Mars branch offices of whatever company they work for are expecting them. Their family, if they have a family on Mars, greets them. Is this person you? Did you travel to Mars? Or did someone who was a lot like you die in a booth in Cincinnati, while a stranger assembled from local Martian matter now walks around convinced that she is you? Most people, when they first encounter this, have an immediate reaction. Something in them says, no, that's not me on Mars. That's a copy. I would be dead. And this reaction, Parfit thought, was extremely revealing, but not in the way the people having it usually assumed. Before we get to why, consider a variation he also ran. In this version, the scanner works, but the disintegrator on Earth fails. So now there are two of you. One is still standing in Cincinnati, confused, perfectly healthy. One is on Mars, also confused, also perfectly healthy. Both of them remember being the person who stepped into the booth. Both have equal claim, if you want to put it that way, to being that person. Which of them is you? The answer can't be both, because they are clearly two different people now, with different futures, different coffee this morning, different everything from the moment the duplication happened. The answer can't be neither, because that would seem to mean the original person simply vanished, and yet the materials and the memories and the psychological content have been preserved in two living human beings. The answer can't be one of them is you and the other isn't, because there is no principled way to choose which. The Cincinnati version has the original body, but the Mars version has equally good continuity of mind. No physical test, no psychological test, no third-person criterion picks one over the other. Parfit's conclusion, the conclusion that took him 15 years of careful work to defend, was that the question which one is really you does not have an answer, because there is nothing for the answer to latch onto. The idea that there must be a fact about which one is you, some deep truth independent of all the facts about bodies and brains and memories, is a picture we inherited from somewhere, and it doesn't correspond to anything in the actual world. We were looking for the chariot again. It isn't there. What is there, he said, is what he called relation R. R is shorthand for psychological continuity, the rich web of memory, intention, character, disposition that connects one stage of a person's life to the next. A 20-year-old and a 30-year-old are connected by R when the 30-year-old remembers being the 20-year-old, carries forward the habits and preferences, inherits the projects. You get R through ordinary biological continuity in a normal life. You could also get R, on his view, through the teleporter. The Mars person has full psychological continuity with the Cincinnati person, even if they're built of different atoms. And in the duplication case, both Mars and Cincinnati have R with the original. There just happen to be two of them. Once you see this, the question which of them is really me starts to look less like a deep metaphysical puzzle and more like a grammatical confusion. There is no really me over and above the facts about R. The question assumes a self that could be traced, the chariot, and the self isn't there. There is only the process, branching or continuing, one strand or two, with or without atoms in common. This is where the thing gets uncomfortable, because it applies to normal life too. Consider the 50-year-old you will be if you live that long. That person will remember being you, will have carried forward a lot of what you care about, will also have changed, will have different preferences, different beliefs, possibly a different politics, almost certainly a different face. The connection between the you now and the 50-year-old you is R. It is strong, but it is not total. Pieces of what makes you you now will have attenuated by then. New things will have replaced them. Now compare that to the Mars case. The Mars version has R with the Cincinnati original, at full strength, undiluted, right at the moment of arrival. In some ways, the Mars version is more continuous with the original than the 50-year-old is with the current you. If R is what matters, then the Mars case should be better than ordinary aging, not a horror. And here, for Parfit, is where the conclusion gets interesting. If what you actually care about when you care about your own survival is not some deep metaphysical you, but rather the continuation of R, the ongoing life of someone who remembers you, carries your projects, holds your people in their regard, then some of the fear of death starts to look misdirected. Not because the loss isn't real, but because the loss you're actually fearing is a different loss than the one you think you're fearing. He put this in one passage that has been quoted many times, in the image of a glass tunnel. He used to feel, he said, that his life was a glass tunnel he was moving through at increasing speed, and at the end of which there was darkness, a specific personal darkness, for him specifically, the extinction of him. When he came to believe what his arguments had led him to believe, that there was no deep further fact about his being him beyond the facts of R, the walls of the tunnel disappeared. He found himself, as he put it, in the open air. His own death still mattered. The loss was still real. but it was not the particular terror it had been. There was nothing in particular to lose over and above what he could see. There are ways to resist this, and they are worth taking seriously. One is to say, fine, Parfit has shown that the concept of personal identity in its everyday strict form is underdefined in edge cases. But edge cases are not ordinary life. In ordinary life, we don't have teleporters. We have continuous biological processes. And within those processes, personal identity tracks whatever it has always tracked well enough. The teleporter is a philosopher's toy, and toys don't overturn what we actually know about actual humans. This is fair, as far as it goes. But it doesn't quite answer Parfit's deeper move, which was not about teleporters specifically. It was about what kind of thing we mean when we say me. Even in ordinary biological continuity, there is a process of cells replacing themselves, memories shifting, character slowly drifting, that does not have, underneath it, some further unchanging item that is the real you. What there is the process. The rest is a pattern we project onto the process to make it easier to talk about. The other resistance, harder to articulate, is the one most people feel immediately and cannot quite let go of. It's the sense that of course there is a further fact. Of course it would be me who steps out on Mars, or not me. One or the other, the universe has to know, even if we can't tell from outside. This feeling is strong. It feels like a perception of something. Parfit's answer to it, which he gave in various forms over the years, was, yes, I know the feeling, I had it too. I am telling you that when you look into it carefully, it is not a perception of anything. It's an intuition shaped by how our minds evolved to track other people and ourselves, and the intuition is wrong in cases where it gets tested. It is also wrong, less visibly, in ordinary cases. We just can't usually tell. Now, here is the thing worth sitting with, and worth being gentle about, because it's easy to miss. If Parfit is right, there is a family resemblance between his conclusion and something Nagasena said to a Greek king 17 centuries earlier in a court near the Indus. Nagasena had argued that when you look for the chariot behind the parts, you don't find anything. Parfit argued that when you look for the self behind the psychological facts, you don't find anything. Two philosophers, starting from very different traditions, with no ability to read each other's work, one looking at the teaching of the Buddha, one looking at the edge cases of personal identity generated by imagined futures, arrived at the same strange place. The self is not a thing that survives or doesn't. It is a pattern, and the pattern's end is not a particular kind of tragedy, because there was never a particular kind of occupant to be the subject of the tragedy. Take a breath here if you want. What Parfit is offering and what Nagasena was offering is not a consolation in the ordinary sense. It does not say, don't worry, you will be fine. It says, the thing you were worried about was not quite the thing that is actually going on. And this is a harder offer because it asks you to reconsider a feeling that is very deep. The feeling that there is a you in there, separate from all the stuff, watching it happen, whose continuation or ending is what all of this is about. A person can take this offer or leave it. Most people, most of the time, leave it because the feeling is so strong that the argument seems like a magic trick. But some people, Parfit, and some of the Buddhists, and probably a few other careful observers scattered through history, have taken it and reported that when you actually take it, something changes. Not that the fear goes away, that the fear has less to grip. There is less you for it to be about. This is the second of 3 moments in this conversation where the question we have been following seems to turn on itself and become a different question. Not what happens to me when I die, but what did I mean by me? The first was Epicurus, quietly pointing out that there was no one home for the catastrophe to happen to. The third is still ahead. But for now, while we are here, with Parfit standing just outside the glass tunnel that used to contain him, it is worth letting the question rest for a minute. Not because it is answered, but because there is something in letting it rest that begins to do its own work. Step into the teleporter, if you like. Notice what stops you. Notice what would stop you if the moment were real. That stopping is the thing Parfit spent 15 years examining, and whatever you decide about his conclusions, the stopping is a piece of information about what you have been assuming about yourself all along, and it is not nothing to have it in your hands. A little more than a decade before Parfit finished his book, a British philosopher had published a paper that argued, from a completely different direction, that the alternative to death, the thing most of us assume we would want if we could get it, was not actually something worth wanting at all. He had a case to make, and he made it carefully, and the case involved a woman who had been 342 years old and had decided to stop. The woman who had lived too long was, in the play, a celebrated opera singer. In 1922, the Czech writer Karel Čapek put her on a Prague stage, and about a decade later, the composer Leoš Janáček set the same material as an opera. Her name in both versions is Elena Makropoulos, though she has used other names over the centuries because people who live a long time learn to rotate their paperwork. She is, when we meet her, 342 years old. Her father had been a court alchemist in the late 16th century, and he had developed, on commission from the emperor, an elixir that would let a person live for 3 centuries. The emperor, being cautious, had insisted that the elixir be tested first on the alchemist's daughter. She was 16. It worked. The emperor, satisfied, took his own dose shortly afterward, though his turned out to be slow and inconclusive, a common problem with testing things on your subjects and then trusting them. Elena, meanwhile, kept going. She became a singer. She survived her father, her generation, her children, her lovers, her century, the next century, a few more. When the play finds her, she is 342 years old, and the effect of the elixir is wearing off. She has perhaps a year left. She has come to Prague to recover a legal document, the one that contains her father's formula, because if she wants to continue, she will have to take another dose. She has the means to do it, she has the opportunity, and the question the play puts to her, and more importantly, the question it puts to the audience watching her, is whether she will. It turns out she will not. She lets the formula go, she lets the year run out, she dies. A British philosopher named Bernard Williams saw Janáček's opera at some point in the 60s, and the play stayed with him. In 1973, he published a paper built around Elena, arguing something that sounds at first almost perverse. His claim was that immortality, the thing most of us, if asked casually, would say we'd like to have, is not actually something we should want. And it is not that immortality is unattainable. His point was more uncomfortable. His point was that if you looked at what immortality would actually be like, from the inside, over a long enough stretch, you would find that it was not a good thing. It was not even a neutral thing. It was, on close inspection, something terrible, and the terribleness had to do with the very structure of what it means to be a person who wants things. Here is the argument, which is subtle enough that it is easy to miss if you are hurrying. When we value something, when we actually want it, as opposed to merely registering its presence, the wanting depends on a kind of forward motion. There are things we want to do, projects we want to finish, people we want to know better, books we mean to write or read or put down for good. Williams called these categorical desires, not in any technical jargon sense, just to distinguish them from the kind of desires that say, if I'm going to be around anyway, I'd like a cup of tea. Categorical desires are different. They are the ones that give you a reason to keep being around. The tea desire assumes you are still here. The categorical desire is part of what makes still being here feel like the kind of thing worth doing. Fine. Now imagine you cannot die. You have the elixir, or its functional equivalent. You are going to keep going at the mental and physical age you currently are indefinitely. For a while, maybe for quite a long while, this will feel marvelous. You will finish the projects you had been meaning to finish. You will read the books. You will learn the languages. You will have the long conversations with the people you love, and when they age and die, you will have the harder conversations, the ones about what their absence means, and you will go on. You will take on new projects. You will fall in love again, possibly several more times. You will travel to the places you never got to. You will build the thing. You will write the book. And then eventually, and here is where the argument begins to bite, you will have done it. All of it. The projects you had categorical desires for, you will have completed. The places will be visited. The books will be read and then reread and then put back on the shelf. The languages will all be learned. You will have been in love as many times as a person can realistically be in love before the pattern starts to feel repetitive. You will, at some point, find that the next project you set yourself is not quite as gripping as the last one, and the one after that even less so, and eventually you will notice that you are doing things mostly to fill time rather than because you want them. This is Alina's situation at 342. She is not bored in the ordinary sense. Bored would be easy to fix. She is something deeper and stranger than bored. She has exhausted, in a way most of us never live long enough to exhaust, the kind of person she is. Her character, the temperament, the interests, the tastes, the particular way of being Elina Makropoulos has run through everything that could reasonably engage it. What remains is the same temperament, meeting new material that no longer lands because the temperament has nowhere new to take it. She is still here. There is still someone she would recognize in the mirror. But the engine that made being her worth the trouble has, quietly, run down. This is the heart of Williams's argument, and it is worth holding up to the light, because it runs against something most of us believe by default. Most of us think that more life is more life. If some life is good, then more of it, presumably, is better. If the problem with death is that it cuts life short, then something that did not cut life short would be, by that very fact, a solution to the problem. More of a good thing is a better thing. Williams is saying this is the mistake. More is not always more when more runs up against the limits of what a particular person can engage with. The goodness of life, he is arguing, depends on there being things a person wants that they have not done yet. Remove that condition by giving them enough time to exhaust their wanting, and the goodness does not just stop growing, it starts inverting. Elina Makropoulos in the final act is not yet suffering. She is not in pain. She is being admired by new young men, as she has been admired by new young men in every generation, and she is playing her part as the mysterious older woman with the kind of professional competence she has had centuries to develop. But she is hollowed out in a way the young men cannot quite see, but the audience is meant to see. She has reached the state that Williams thought any sufficiently long-lived creature would eventually reach, the state in which the only categorical desire still available is the desire to stop. And here is where his argument arrives at its real provocation. The structure we hate about death, the cutting off, the forced ending of a person who still has things they want, is also looked at from another angle, the condition that keeps the wanting alive. Limited time is what makes categorical desires categorical. If you had infinite time, the desires would not stay urgent. They would soften, dissipate, get postponed, eventually unravel. Death, by setting the horizon, is what keeps the foreground vivid. It is not merely the price of life having structure, it is part of what gives life structure. This is a difficult thing to accept because it seems to be saying that a fact we grieve, our own mortality, is actually a condition of the good things we would not want to lose. Our dread of death and our love of what death cuts short are on this account more tightly bound than we realize. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot, at any rate, have the vividness, the urgency, the sense of this matters now, without also having the finitude that forces things to matter now rather than indefinitely. Not everyone has accepted this. There have been careful responses. One common reply runs like this: Williams is imagining immortality as the same person, frozen at a certain age, persisting unchanged through centuries. But that is not the only possibility. Imagine instead that you continue to age, mentally and emotionally, that you keep developing, that new interests arise, that your character itself deepens and shifts in ways you can't predict. In that case, exhaustion would not be inevitable because the person doing the desiring would itself be changing. The 30-year-old Elena might have exhausted the 30-year-old's desires, but perhaps by 300 she would have been a different person, with a whole new set of things to care about, and the cycle could go on, each century bringing a new self with new categorical desires. This is a real response, and it softens Williams's conclusion somewhat. But it also concedes something important. If the thing that survives across the centuries is not the same person, but a long chain of persons, each one succeeding the last as the previous one's desires exhaust, then what we have is not quite you living forever. It is more like you being the first link in an indefinitely long chain of people who remember you. Whether that counts as immortality, in any sense a person would have wanted, is itself a hard question. You might as well say that ordinary children are the solution to death because they remember you and carry something of you forward. There is a sense in which that's true, and there is a sense in which it has nothing to do with the specific fear most people mean when they say they fear dying. There is another response, harder to put gently, which is that the whole argument is a product of a certain temperament. Williams was a reflective, literary man, someone for whom life was organized around projects and their completion. For a person like that, the exhaustion of projects feels like the exhaustion of life itself. But not everyone is like that. Some people live in a register where each day is more or less its own thing, not particularly connected to a project, and where the pleasures of being alive, warm light, a conversation, food, the weather, don't seem to run out in the way projects do. For such a person, Elena's exhaustion might not be the human default. It might just be Bernard Williams's exhaustion, generalized. This is worth noting because it means Williams's argument is doing something subtler than it first appears. It is not proving that immortality is bad for any conceivable being. It is pointing out that immortality, for the kind of being we actually are, for the kind of being with categorical desires and a sense of projects and an engine that runs on things yet to be done, might be incompatible with what makes that kind of being valuable to itself. Other kinds of beings might do fine with forever. We probably would not. It is worth putting this beside what the Gita had said on the battlefield at Kurukshetra. Krishna had told Arjuna that the true self, being eternal, is not something that dies. Williams is saying from a very different direction that if the eternal thing is actually you in the way you care about, with your memories, your particular loves, your temperament, then eternity is not what you wanted after all. The Upanishadic picture answers this in its way by saying that the thing that goes on is not the particular Elena. It is the deeper substance beneath all the Elenas and Vanyas and momentary shapes. But if you try to combine the two, if you try to imagine Elena going on, not some abstract substrate, you get Williams's picture, and the picture is not consoling, which may be one reason the traditions that believe in personal survival tend not to imagine it as an extension of this life. They imagine something else, a transfigured state, a reunion with God, a return to the source. They are not offering you more of the same. They are offering you something categorically different, a kind of existence in which the exhaustion that would overtake an extended Elena does not apply. Whether such a thing is possible or coherent is a question beyond what argument can settle. But you can see, if you look, why they offer that rather than simply more life. Simply more life, it turns out, is not an offer anyone who has thought about it carefully would accept. Elena, in the last scene of the play, hands the formula to a young woman in the room. The young woman, wide-eyed, holds it for a moment. Then, in one of the most quietly radical gestures in modern theatre, she burns it. Not because she is afraid, because she has been listening to Elena for 3 acts, and she has understood what the formula is, and she has decided. The life the formula promises is not a better life than the one she has. It is worse, in the specific sense Williams spent his paper explaining. What she has, with its ending, is the thing worth wanting. What the formula offers, without its ending, is not. Whether she is right is not something a play can settle for us. But the image is hard to forget, and it leaves the question in a particular place. If you really could have the elixir, would you take it? And not just for a week or a year or a decade, but for as long as it keeps working. 3 centuries, 6 centuries, 10. At what point would you, like Alina, let the year run out? The honest answer for most of us is that we do not know. And the reason we do not know is not cowardice or confusion. It is that we have never been in the position to find out, and the argument about whether we should want it from here is only ever going to be partly decided by reason. The rest is decided by something more like taste, and taste is hard to consult through the walls of a life we have not yet lived. But the thought that the answer might in the end be no, that a life without an ending might not, after careful consideration, be the life we want, changes something about the ending we actually have. Not in the Stoic way, where you make peace with what is coming because there is no other option. In a different way, in the way that notices that what is coming was not, on reflection, avoidable, without giving up something else we didn't know we were holding. A long-dead thinker in the European philosophical tradition had written about something like this, though from an angle so different it is almost surprising to find the two pictures in the same neighborhood. He had said that what appears to us as an individual life, yearning and failing and ending, is in fact the surface expression of something deeper, and that the ending of the surface is not the ending of what was underneath. He had been read in his lifetime by almost no one. By the time of his death, his ideas were starting to move, and they would, over the next century, reach places he could not have expected. For most of his life, Arthur Schopenhauer was almost entirely unread. He published the book he considered his life's work in 1818 when he was 30 years old, and for the next 30 years the book sat on shelves and did not move. He had enemies in the academic philosophy of his time, most notably Hegel, whose reputation was at its peak and whose system took up most of the available oxygen in the German universities. Schopenhauer detested Hegel with a specificity and energy that would have been impressive if it had been reciprocated, but it was not. Hegel was not especially aware of Schopenhauer. Nobody was. In 1820, Schopenhauer secured a teaching position in Berlin and arranged his lectures to be scheduled at the exact hour Hegel was lecturing across the hall. He had assumed that when students discovered a more rigorous philosopher in the adjacent room, they would migrate. They did not migrate. Hegel's room remained full. Schopenhauer's room remained nearly empty. After a few semesters, he gave up teaching, left Berlin, and spent most of the next 3 decades in Frankfurt, walking his poodle and working on subsequent editions of the book nobody was reading. Then, very slowly, starting around 1851, something began to shift. A collection of his essays, written for a more general audience, found readers it could keep. Those readers told other readers. By the time he died in 1860, at 72, he was famous. Wagner had read him. Tolstoy would read him. Nietzsche, still a teenager when Schopenhauer died, would pick up the book a few years later and describe the encounter as one of the formative experiences of his intellectual life. The book had, belatedly, arrived, and with it, a picture of what we are and what happens when we stop. The picture is strange, and to get to the part about death, you have to go through the metaphysics a little. Schopenhauer's fundamental claim is that reality has 2 aspects. There is the world as we perceive it, the world of objects, bodies, events, causes and effects, the ordinary world of experience. This world he calls representation. It is how reality presents itself to a mind that is organized to perceive space, time and causality. It is, in a real sense, our world. But underneath this world, he argues, is something else, a single undifferentiated reality that is not itself in space or time, not divided into objects, not subject to the ordinary rules of cause and effect. This underlying reality he calls will. The word is confusing because in English we use will to mean conscious intention, and that is not what he means. He means something more like the blind striving that seems to push through all of nature, the thing that makes plants grow, that makes animals pursue food, that makes bodies heal themselves, that makes you want things before you know why you want them. This striving, for Schopenhauer, is not a byproduct of things existing. It is what exists at the deepest level. The objects of the world are the surface appearance of this one underlying will, refracted through the mind's organizing principles into the many separate things we seem to see. If you are a thing in the world of representation, a body, an individual, Ivan or Elena or anyone, then you are, on this view, a particular expression of the will, temporarily taking the shape of a separate person. But underneath your individuality and underneath everyone else's, there is only the one will, undivided, not subject to the rules that govern bodies. What this means for death becomes, if you follow it through, extraordinary. When you die, Schopenhauer says, what happens is that the particular expression stops. The body falls apart. The individual form that the will had been taking, in your case, dissolves. But the will itself, the deeper thing that was the real substance of what you were, does not dissolve because it was never in time to begin with. It was never the kind of thing that could dissolve. What ends is the surface. What was underneath goes on, not because it survives the event, but because it was never the kind of thing the event could touch. He uses, at various places in the book, an image that he returned to enough times that it has come to be associated with him. Consider, he says, a drop of water rising from the sea. The drop has, for a moment, a distinct shape. It is round. It reflects the sun. You could point to it and call it a particular drop. And then, a moment later, it falls back into the sea. The shape is gone. The drop is gone. But nothing substantial has left the world. The water is still water. The sea is still there. The drop was a form the water was briefly holding, and the water did not suffer any loss when the form relaxed. You are, in this picture, the drop. The shape is temporary. The shape will fall. What was being held in the shape, the will, the underlying reality, is not reducible to the shape and is not harmed by the shape's ending. This sounds, to a Western reader, like a Buddhist or Vedantic metaphor, and the similarity is not accidental. Schopenhauer had access, in the early 19th century, to the first German translations of the Upanishads that had been smuggled out of India through Persian intermediaries, and he read them with a kind of religious intensity. He said in his later writings that the Upanishads had been the consolation of his life and would be the consolation of his death. He kept a copy by his bed. The central claim he found in those texts, that the individual self is a temporary surface of a deeper, undivided reality, and that recognizing this is the beginning of being at peace with one's mortality, became the structural backbone of his own philosophy. He took a European metaphysical framework and filled it with a picture that had been worked out on another continent 2,500 years earlier. This raises a question worth noting because it recurs in the history of these ideas. When two traditions, starting from very different places, arrive at similar pictures, the drop and the ocean, the wave and the sea, the arrangement of parts that propagates without an owner. What does the convergence mean? One possibility is that the pictures are grasping something real about how things are, and independent minds, looking carefully, find it. Another possibility is that the human mind, facing the prospect of its own ending, is disposed to generate certain kinds of consoling images, and the convergence is a fact about minds rather than about reality. There is no way to tell from the convergence alone which of these is the case. You can believe either one without contradicting the evidence. What remains, though, regardless of how you interpret it, is the image itself. The drop that falls back into the sea, the wave that subsides into the water. These have an emotional texture that argument cannot quite reach. You can read the argument and disagree with every step, but the image, once it is in you, does something to how the prospect of ending sits in your body. It gives the ending a different shape than the shape it has when it is imagined as simple extinction. Not necessarily a truer shape, a different shape. Whether the different shape is truer is the question the argument cannot settle for you. About 600 years before Schopenhauer was reading the Upanishads in Germany, in a town in central Anatolia that is now called Konya, a Persian scholar and poet was writing the opening lines of what would become one of the longest spiritual poems in any language. His name was Jalal ad-Din, known to his students as Mevlana, our master, and in the English-speaking world now mostly as Rumi. He had been, before his conversion to the mystical branch of Islam called Sufism, a respectable jurist and theologian. Then a wandering dervish named Shams had arrived in Konya and turned his life over, and he had spent the rest of his days writing poetry that was, essentially, love poetry, though the beloved in the poetry was God. The work that preserves most of his teaching is called the Masnavi, and its opening lines are famous enough that many Persian speakers today can still recite them from memory. They begin with an image that is, at first, strange. Listen to the reed, the poem says. Listen to the reed and the tale it is telling. It speaks of its separation. The reed in question is a ney, a flute, which is carved from a length of cane that has been cut from the riverbed where it grew. To make the ney, you cut the cane, hollow it, bore holes in it, and leave it to dry. The thing is, in a way, violently disassembled from what it used to be. It is no longer a living plant. It is no longer rooted in the water. It is, instead, an instrument that, when breath is passed through it, makes a specific and unmistakable sound, a plaintive, slightly reedy cry that anyone who has heard the Sufi musical tradition will recognize. And the poem's claim, in the opening lines, is that the sound the ney makes is the sound of its missing home. It cries in the hands of the player because it remembers the riverbed. It was cut from something it loved. The music it makes is not a pure invention. It is a translation of longing into sound. Rumi uses this as the central image for what the soul is. The soul, in his picture, has been cut from its original home. It has been taken out of the divine presence from which it came, hollowed, given holes, made into an instrument. The sounds it makes, its longings, its loves, its griefs, are all, underneath, the same sound. They are the reed crying for the riverbed. And death, in this picture, is not an ending. It is the return. It is the moment the cut piece goes back to the cane from which it was taken. In the Sufi tradition, the anniversary of Rumi's death is not mourned. It is called Sheb-i-Arus, the wedding night. He had been longing for this return all his life. When it came, it was not a loss. This is a different kind of image from Schopenhauer's. His was geometric, almost, the drop and the sea, the shape and the substance, the metaphysics laid out clean. Rumi's is wet and raw. It is about separation, about the specific grief of having been cut from what you love. It is about the sound that longing makes in a body that has been hollowed out for the sound to come through. But underneath the very different textures, the picture is recognizably the same. There is an origin. There is a separated form. The form, while it lasts, has its own voice, its own life. And the ending of the form is a going home, not a disappearance. Whether either of these pictures is true is not something a chapter can determine. What can be noticed is that they are very old, and they come from very different parts of the world, and they are offered with great seriousness by people who had thought about the question harder and longer than most of us will. Neither Schopenhauer nor Rumi is saying take comfort from this. They are saying this is what I think is actually the case. And they are saying it in images because the images do something that argument cannot. The images reach a part of a listener that argument often cannot reach, and they settle there and they stay. You can dismiss them. You can hear the reed and decide it is merely beautiful, not informative. You can watch the drop return to the sea and find the image moving without believing it tells you anything. The dismissal is available. But before you dismiss, it is worth noting that the images, for many of the people who have met them, have done something that did not require belief. They have changed the shape of the ending in the imagination from a wall to a threshold. That is not the same as proving anything, but it may not be nothing either. Not long after Rumi was writing in Konya, and not long before Schopenhauer would read the Upanishads in Germany, a third voice, modern and French and deeply opposed to both of their consolations, would frame the question from a direction neither of them had considered, and would insist that the task was not to soften the ending, but to live in its full indifference with a kind of fierce, open-eyed refusal to be consoled at all. In the spring of 1942, in an occupied France that had been at war for less than 2 years and would be for another 3, a 28-year-old Algerian-born writer published a short book of essays under an odd title. The title was The Myth of Sisyphus, and the opening sentence has been quoted so often that it can be hard to hear what it actually says. There is only one really serious philosophical problem, Albert Camus wrote. It is suicide. He did not mean this as provocation, though it has usually been read as provocation. He meant it as a simple observation about what philosophy, if it is serious, is for. The question of whether to go on living, not merely whether to breathe and eat, but whether being alive is something a person, on reflection, consents to, sits underneath every other philosophical question. If you decide it is not, the other questions become moot. If you decide it is, you have made a claim that needs defending, because the case that life is worth living is not, in Camus' view, obvious. The case has to be made, and the making of it, he thought, was what philosophy at its most honest was actually doing. He had come to this through a particular experience, one that he described in various ways as the experience of the absurd. The absurd for Camus is not a feature of the world exactly. It is not a feature of the mind exactly. It is something that happens in the meeting of the two. On one side, there is a human being, the kind of creature that asks why, that reaches for reasons, that looks at circumstances and wants to know what they mean, what they are for, what they point to. On the other side, there is the world, enormous, old, indifferent, entirely uninterested in being meaningful, offering nothing back when the human asks. The absurd is not on either side. It is in the confrontation between them, a person's demand for meaning meeting the world's silent refusal to provide any. Two things that do not fit together and cannot, and yet are stuck in the same room. Most people, most of the time, do not notice this. They move through their days absorbed in whatever is in front of them, and the question of what it is all for does not surface. But occasionally it does. A woman in a cafe looks around and feels suddenly that nothing she can see matters at all, and that the cafe she is in, and the street outside, and the life she has been leading in that street are held up by nothing, are suspended over an emptiness she can almost see through the floor. A man, on a Monday morning on his way to work, is stopped in the middle of the sidewalk by a thought that will not go away. Why, he thinks, am I doing this? Why is any of this? The question, once it lands, does not dissolve easily. It may follow him for days. It may follow him for the rest of his life. This experience, Camus said, is the encounter with the absurd, and once you have had it properly, you cannot unhave it. You can distract yourself from it. You can bury it under work or company or small hopes. But you will know, afterward, that there is something underneath your ordinary days that does not cohere, and that the coherence you had been relying on was, to some extent, an arrangement you were keeping in place by not looking at it too closely. The question Camus then asks, the question the book is really about, is what to do with this once you have seen it. He considered 3 options and rejected 2 of them. The first option is suicide. If the world is meaningless and your demand for meaning is perpetually frustrated, then one way to resolve the frustration is to stop demanding, stop living, cut the knot. This, Camus argued, is a mistake, and he was quite specific about why. Suicide is not a solution to the absurd, it is a surrender to it. It concedes that because the world does not offer meaning, there is nothing worth doing. But this concession, he said, accepts the very premise that ought to be refused. The absurd is the confrontation between the demand and the silence. To take your own life because the world is silent is to abandon the demand, and the demand is the thing that made you what you were. You do not solve the problem by eliminating the party that was complaining. You just remove the complaint. The second option he called philosophical suicide, and by this he meant something more specific than ordinary despair. He meant the move many religious and philosophical traditions make when confronted with meaninglessness, of inventing meaning by appeal to something beyond the visible world. If the world here is silent, perhaps there is a world elsewhere that is not. If time cancels our efforts, perhaps there is an eternity that preserves them. If no evident order lies behind events, perhaps there is a hidden order we cannot see from here. These moves, Camus argued, are moves of the same shape as ordinary suicide. They too resolve the absurd by eliminating one of its terms. Ordinary suicide eliminates the human. Philosophical suicide eliminates the world's silence by filling the silence with something imagined. Both are ways of refusing to stay in the confrontation. Both, in his view, are a failure of nerve. He is not here dismissing religion as such. He was more complicated about religion than his reputation suggests. What he is dismissing is the use of religion, or of philosophy, or of any system of consoling ideas as a way to make the absurd go away. To believe in heaven in order to stop feeling the silence is, in his terms, to cheat. You have to not cheat. That is the whole discipline of the position he is trying to articulate. Which leaves the third option, and this is the move the book is really for. You can live with the absurd. You can keep both terms in play. You can continue to demand meaning and continue to be met with silence and refuse to resolve the confrontation in either direction. This is not a stable state. It is not meant to be. It is a kind of permanent tension, and the tension is what Camus called revolt. Revolt, in his sense, is not political. It is not even primarily ethical. It is a specific orientation toward one's own existence. It says, the world offers nothing, and I will continue anyway, not because I have tricked myself into believing it offers something, not because I have decided to look away from the silence, because I am here, and as long as I am here, I will press against what is given. I will continue to ask. I will continue to act as though my actions matter, knowing they don't, and the knowing they don't will not stop the acting. That stance, the refusal to be consoled, combined with the refusal to stop, is what Camus thought a person facing the absurd honestly had to become. The image he used in the last essay of the book is one that has attached itself to his name more firmly than the argument. It is the image of Sisyphus from the old Greek story. The gods had condemned Sisyphus, for reasons that varied in the telling, to an eternal punishment. He was to push a large stone up a hill. When he reached the top, the stone would roll back down, and he would have to descend and push it up again. Forever. No progress, no arrival. Just the pushing, and the rolling down, and the pushing. Camus is interested in a specific moment in this story. The moment when Sisyphus, having reached the top and watched the stone roll back, walks down the hill to fetch it. On the way up, he is struggling. The effort takes everything. There is no space for reflection. On the way down, for a few minutes, there is nothing to do. He is just walking. He is, in that walk, conscious of his situation, of its absurdity, of its futility, of the fact that it will never end and will never produce anything. This is the moment, for Camus, where the whole question turns. If Sisyphus is in despair during that walk, then his punishment has worked. He has been broken by it, and the gods have succeeded. But if he is not in despair, if somehow he walks down the hill with his eyes open, aware of everything and still, somehow, fine, then the punishment has failed, and he has found something the gods did not plan for. He has found that awareness of futility is not the same as being destroyed by it. He can know what his situation is. He can refuse to pretend it is otherwise, and he can still, inexplicably, be all right. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote, in the line that has been quoted and misread for 80 years. He did not mean Sisyphus is secretly enjoying the task or has convinced himself the rock matters. He meant that Sisyphus, conscious of his situation, is in a state that can only be called happy because he has refused the two options that would have unmade him, refused to give up and refused to pretend. He has found a third thing. He is, on the walk down the hill, simply present to what his life is, and the presence is sufficient. This is the position Camus wanted to articulate for human beings in general. We are all, in a sense, in Sisyphus's situation. Our efforts will not persist. Our projects will be absorbed. Our names, even if they are remembered for a while, will eventually fade into the general background noise of history. The stone we push will roll back down. This is not pessimism, it is description. And the question is whether, knowing this, we can still be in our lives without either ending them or lying about them. He thought yes, not easily, not as a default, but possibly, and, the book is arguing, nobly, as a kind of achievement. The achievement is not that you conquer the absurd, you do not conquer it. The achievement is that you refuse to be finished by it. You keep showing up, you keep pressing against the day. You love the people you love, though loving them will not save them. You do the work, though the work will not outlast you in any form that matters. You notice the light on the wall in the afternoon, and none of this requires belief in anything beyond what is evidently there. This is, on its face, a harder position than the ones we have been looking at. Epicurus offered a reasoning that removed the fear. The Gita offered a picture that made the fear irrelevant. Rumi offered an image that turned death into a going home. Williams offered a reframing that made the fear less coherent. Camus offers none of this. He looks at death, at meaninglessness, at the specific silence of the universe, and he says, yes, all of it. And then, without any softening, continue. Some people find this bracing. Some find it evasive, a refusal dressed up as a philosophy. The objection, when it comes, usually takes this form. You cannot actually sustain the position Camus describes. Human beings are not built to live in permanent, unresolved tension. Either the awareness of the absurd will eventually break you, or you will inevitably drift into one of the consolations he rejects. The position is a pose, not a livable stance, and whether Camus himself lived it, whether the man who wrote the book actually walked down the hill in the state he was describing, is something the biography does not clearly settle. There is something to this objection, and it is worth sitting with. But there is also something to the counter-response, which is that Camus never claimed the position was easy, or that anyone held it perfectly. He claimed it was available as a direction, as an orientation. You could aim at it. You could occasionally achieve it for a morning or a week. You could know, when you drifted into consolation, that you had drifted and you could come back. The position is not a fortress. It is a practice in a different sense from the practice the Bardo Thodol describes, but a practice nonetheless, one you would keep failing at and returning to. Whether the practice is worth doing is a question nobody else can answer for you. Camus is not recommending it to everyone. He is describing it carefully for the people for whom the consolations have stopped working, who find that the old pictures have started to feel like pictures, and who need a way to go on without pictures. For those people, the book is a kind of companion. For others, it will seem beside the point, a solution in search of a problem they do not have. That is fair. Not everybody meets the absurd in the same way, or at the same time, or at all. What the book offers is not a universal prescription. It is a shape for a particular kind of life, and an argument that the shape is possible. And what it offers, more than anything, is a way of keeping one's eyes open at the end. If the position is real, if a person can actually walk down Sisyphus's hill with full awareness and not be broken, then dying when it comes does not require a story. It can be met as Sisyphus meets the rolling stone, not with consolation, not with terror, with the same quiet presence that the rest of the life had, if the life had been lived in Camus's sense. It is a kind of courage that does not feel like courage from inside. It just feels like continuing. There was a man in Cambridge, 8 years after Camus's book was published, who did something not exactly like this, but not exactly unlike it either, on the last night of his own life. He had been one of the most severe philosophical minds of his century. He had written a single short book in his 30s and then spent the rest of his life revising what he thought the book had meant. And at the end, asked what to tell his friends. He said something that has puzzled readers ever since, not because it was cryptic, but because it was so simple it seemed impossible that the man who said it had meant it. On the evening of April 28, 1951, in a house on Storey's Way in Cambridge, a man of 62 was lying in an upstairs bedroom being tended by the wife of his doctor. His name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. He had been staying in the house for several months because he had prostate cancer and had asked, when he was told his condition was terminal, not to die in a hospital. The family that had taken him in were the Bevans, Edward Bevan, a physician, and his wife Joan, who had been nervous about having him in the house at first because Wittgenstein had a reputation, and the reputation was not for ease. She had been wrong to worry. Over the weeks he had been with them, she and Wittgenstein had become something like friends. He had walked with her in the afternoons when his strength allowed. He had been, in his own unusual way, funny. He had not treated her as a doctor's wife but as a person in her own right, which was not something everyone in Cambridge had bothered to do, and she had come to care about him. On the evening of the 28th, she was sitting with him. He had been sliding in and out of lucidity during the day. The doctor had come by and told him, gently, that the end was probably not far off. A day or two, maybe less. Wittgenstein had received the information calmly. He had asked her at some point that evening what his friends had been told about his condition. A few of them were scheduled to visit the next morning. Whether they knew he was dying, she wasn't sure. Probably not in so many words. She told him so. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said something, quietly, almost casually, that she remembered well enough afterward to write down. "Tell them," he said, "I've had a wonderful life." He went to sleep shortly after. He did not wake up. The sentence has puzzled readers ever since. It has puzzled them not because it is obscure, but because it comes from the wrong mouth. If any of a dozen other figures in the 20th century had said it, it would have been unremarkable. A generous man at the end of his days saying a generous thing. But Wittgenstein had not been a generous man, not in the easy way the sentence seems to imply. He had been, by most accounts, difficult, demanding, frequently miserable, subject to long stretches of despair that his friends had struggled to follow him into. He had spent large portions of his adult life convinced that his work was a failure. He had handed away an inherited fortune because he believed wealth corrupted him. He had sought out, at various points, the hardest possible circumstances for himself, working as a rural schoolteacher in Austrian villages where the children hated him, volunteering for the most dangerous posts in 2 world wars, living in one-room huts in Norway and Ireland for months at a time because he could not think in more comfortable settings. A wonderful life is not an obvious description of that life assessed from outside. And yet this is what he said, not in some earlier, more optimistic period, but on his last evening, after almost everything that could hurt him had already hurt him, after his body had been wrecked by the cancer that was about to finish him. He said it to a woman he had not known well a year earlier, to be passed on to friends he was not going to see again. And he meant it clearly enough that she remembered the exact words. To understand what he might have meant, it helps to have some sense of what he had thought over the decades, about the kind of thing death was. He had written about it briefly in the first book he published, a book called The Tractatus, completed in the trenches of the First World War and published in 1921. The book was short and almost unreadable in the usual sense. It was organized into numbered propositions, each proposition stacked as commentary on the one before it, and the style was austere even by the standards of philosophy. Most of it was about logic and language, but a few propositions, near the end, turned to ethics and death and what Wittgenstein called the mystical, and these had an eerie telegraphic quality, as though they were bringing back messages from a country he had visited and could not fully describe. One of those propositions said, "Death is not an event in life. Death is not lived through." This is a strange sentence and worth holding up to the light for a minute. He is not saying death doesn't matter. He is pointing at something structural. Everything you call an event in your life is something that happens to you, that you register, that you experience as part of the ongoing texture of being alive. Even terrible events, losses, injuries, griefs, are events in your life because you are there for them, you feel them, they are added to the sum of what you have been through. Death is the one thing that does not fit this description. Death is not an experience. There is no moment at which you register having died, because the registering requires the presence that is precisely what has ended. Death is not something in the list of things that will happen to you. It is the point at which the list stops. And a related proposition, a few lines later, at death the world does not change, it ends. He meant, one thinks, exactly this. Your death is not a change in the world that you will observe. Things do not become different for you when you die. There is no transition from one state to another because transitions require a subject to undergo them, and the subject is exactly what is no longer present. What happens instead is that the whole field, the world as it is for you, the thing you have been inhabiting, simply stops being there, not because it has been destroyed, but because there is no longer anyone for whom it is there. The ending is not an event. The ending is the absence of any further events. There is a famous proposition of his from the same part of the book which gets quoted often but is usually clipped of its context. If by eternity we understand not endless temporal duration but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. This is not, on his view, a mystical consolation. It is almost the opposite. He is saying that the usual picture of eternal life, of more time, of a continuation that goes on and on past the point of the body's failure, is confused. Eternity, if the word means anything useful, does not mean more time. It means a relationship to time that is different in kind. And the only relationship to time that is different in kind, the only one we have actually got available to us, is the one where we are located in the present moment, not stretched out toward a future, not longing for a past. To live fully present in the particular now that is happening is, he thought, as close to eternity as a human being gets. Not an eternity stretched into duration, an eternity contracted into this breath. What might it have been to have spent most of a lifetime thinking sentences like these, and then, at the end, to have said, "I've had a wonderful life"? One possibility is that the sentence is ironic. Wittgenstein was capable of irony, but the woman who heard it did not hear it as irony, and she had spent enough time with him to know the difference. She reported it as a plain statement, said quietly and with some feeling. Another possibility is that he was being kind. He knew he was about to die. He knew his friends would need something to hold on to. Rather than leave them with a bitter or enigmatic last line, he offered a simple one that could be carried forward. On this reading, the sentence is not really about his assessment of his life, it is about his affection for the people he was leaving. Both of these readings are defensible, and neither quite fits. The sentence, as it was said, did not feel performed. It felt like a report. The man who had spent his life being unreasonably hard on himself, who had experienced his own existence as a moral struggle he was usually losing, This man, at the end, pronounced the life wonderful, and the pronouncement was made by someone who had spent decades writing about what death is and what the shape of a life is and what it might mean to live in the present. If anyone had prepared carefully for the making of such a sentence, it was him. The reading that seems most true, though it cannot be proved, is that by the end the question of whether his life had been happy in the ordinary sense had simply stopped being the right question. His life had been what it had been. The misery was real. The struggle was real. The failed attempts at connection, the long solitudes, the relentless self-examination, all real. But underneath all of it, or perhaps inside all of it, there had been something that was not the happiness of ease, but was also not the absence of happiness. There had been a kind of intensity, a way of being present to what was in front of him, that in the final reckoning he recognized as good. Good to have done, good to have been, not despite the suffering, in some stranger way, not even unconnected from it, just good. He had written once that the solution of the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of the problem. Meaning, one thinks, that you do not solve the question of how to live by arriving at an answer. You solve it by reaching a point where the question no longer has the grip on you it once had. You no longer need to know what life is for. You are simply in it now, with a specific person sitting with you in a room, and the window is open and the evening is coming on, and this is a life, and it has been a wonderful one. There is an argument against this reading, and it should be acknowledged. The argument is that Wittgenstein could not have meant what he said because his life really was, by most ordinary measures, difficult, and saying it was wonderful was either a kindness or a delusion. The objection has force. Many lives are measurably bad, filled with pain, with injustice, with losses that do not heal, and calling them wonderful would be a lie, an insult to the actual shape of the experience. Not everyone who says at the end that their life was wonderful would be right to say it. Some people would be telling themselves the last in a long series of comforting stories. But this is a reason for humility about the claim, not a reason to dismiss it. Some of the people who say at the end that their lives were wonderful are saying something that matches, as closely as any sentence can, the texture of what the life was for them from the inside. You cannot tell from outside which case you are looking at. You can only listen carefully to what was said and to how it was said and to the person who said it, and make the best judgment you can about what was going on. In Wittgenstein's case, the best judgment available to the woman who was there, and to the friends who knew him, and to readers who have thought about it since, seems to be that he was reporting accurately. He had lived, and he knew what he had lived, and when asked what to say about it, he did not exaggerate, and he did not deflect. He said what he had found to be true. This is not, on reflection, a small thing for the author of the Tractatus to have said. It is, possibly, the most significant sentence he ever produced. Not because it was profound, because it was simple, and it came from him, and he meant it. What it would mean for the rest of us to reach an end and be able to say something similar, this is a question with no general answer. It would depend on the life, on how the life had been lived, on what the person had done with the time they had been given. But it might be the case that the direction a person was pointing themselves in over the years made the difference. Not by aiming at wonderfulness directly, that would be another consoling picture, another story to tell oneself. By aiming at something else, at honesty, perhaps, at presence, at the project of being actually here, as a specific person, rather than somewhere else, being an idea of oneself. The wonderful, if it comes, would come as a kind of byproduct. It would not be the goal. It would be what a life looked like from the inside, when the goal had been something else. This is, perhaps, as close as the question gets to a practical answer in anyone's hands. Not what happens when you die, which the chapters so far have approached from 15 directions without settling. But what kind of living would produce a last sentence you could mean? The two questions are different. One is about what is on the other side. The other is about what was on this one. There is one more place before the end where the two questions meet in a particularly uncomfortable way. It meets in a recent clinical observation, one that has been written about with increasing frequency in medical journals over the last decade, and that involves people who, by every available measure, should not be capable of producing a last sentence at all, and who, in a small and surprising number of cases, produce one anyway. In a hospice in the American Midwest, a woman in her mid-80s is nearing the end of a long decline with advanced Alzheimer's disease. For 3 years, she has not known her son's name. For 2 years, she has not reliably recognized him when he visits. For the last 6 months, she has not spoken in coherent sentences, has needed help with everything, has been, in most of the ways that matter, already somewhere else. On a Tuesday afternoon, a nurse checking on her finds her sitting up in bed with an unusual alertness. Her eyes are focused. She looks at her son, who has come in for his daily visit expecting nothing, and says his name. Then she says, clearly and in a voice he has not heard in years, that she loves him, that she is proud of him, and that she is tired now, but that she has had a good life and he should not be too sad. She talks for about 20 minutes. Her memory, during those minutes, seems almost intact. She asks about her grandchildren by name, then she gets tired. She lies back down. She dies 6 hours later. The medical name for what happened in that room is terminal lucidity, though some researchers prefer the broader term paradoxical lucidity, because similar episodes have been documented in patients who didn't turn out to be at the end of life and who continued on in their diminished state afterward. The phenomenon has been noted sporadically for over 200 years. German physicians in the 19th century wrote about it. Nurses and hospice workers have always known about it. It's part of the oral tradition of end-of-life care. What has changed in the last decade is that it has begun to be studied systematically. The results of those studies are uncertain, and the uncertainty is itself interesting. When you ask caregivers retrospectively whether they've ever witnessed a dementia patient return to apparent clarity in the days before death, the rate at which they say yes is startlingly high. In some surveys, somewhere between 60 and 70% of caregivers with long experience. This is an extraordinary number if it's accurate. It would mean the phenomenon is not rare at all, just rarely reported outside the immediate bedside. But when researchers do prospective studies, watching patients over time with formal documentation rather than asking after the fact, the numbers come down sharply. A small study published in 2025, which followed 20 hospice patients with advanced dementia using continuous observation, found clear episodes of lucidity in 3 of them. That's 15%, not 60, and even that number has caveats. The observations weren't blinded. The family members who witnessed the episodes were often the ones scoring them. There's room for the hope of seeing someone come back to slightly shade what is observed into something that seems like coming back. Both numbers might be telling us something true. The retrospective reports might be inflated by memory, by the understandable tendency to remember the vivid exceptions and forget the many nights that did not produce an exception. The prospective studies might be missing episodes because a 15-minute window of clarity in a 24-hour day is easy to be absent for. The true rate is probably somewhere between these estimates, and we don't yet know where. What seems hard to dismiss across the accounts is that some of the episodes happen. They happen in people whose brains on imaging are so damaged that the return of coherent speech and accurate memory should not be possible by what we currently understand of how brains work. And when they happen at the end of a long decline, they tend to happen within days of death, often within hours. The question of what is happening mechanically in those hours has no settled answer. A paper in 2024 proposed that the brain's regular baseline in advanced dementia may be obscuring capacities that are still present, that the plaques and tangles and atrophy do not necessarily destroy the underlying networks, but rather prevent them from firing efficiently in ordinary circumstances. Something about the dying process, the hypothesis runs, temporarily lifts the obstruction. The old networks briefly get through. This is speculative. There is no direct evidence for it, but it is the kind of hypothesis that could, in principle, be tested as instrumentation improves. The other possibility, which the current evidence does not let us rule out, is that something more is going on than the brain's networks briefly firing through accumulated damage. The degree of recovery in some of the accounts is striking enough that it raises questions the standard picture has trouble answering. Not impossible questions, not questions that require any particular metaphysics to be right, just questions the standard picture has not yet given a clean answer to. This is where the story we have been following circles back to where it started. Because the same conversation, the one about what happens in the brain when a person is at the end, and what that tells us about the relationship between brains and consciousness, has been running in parallel tracks on different data for the last dozen years. The gamma surges that the Michigan neuroscientist saw in her rats, and then in a small number of human patients a decade later, are part of the same puzzle. So are the recalled experiences of cardiac arrest survivors collected by the physician in New York. So are the episodes of terminal lucidity. Each of them, on its own, is a small oddity. Put together, they are a pattern that the simple materialist picture, brain goes, mind goes, end of story, has not yet quite absorbed. This does not mean the materialist picture is wrong. It might just mean the picture is incomplete in ways that further research will clarify. That's the likeliest outcome, honestly. Science has encountered many apparent anomalies that eventually turned out to be artifacts or misunderstandings or genuinely interesting but fully natural phenomena that fit, once understood, into the existing frame. Any of those outcomes is possible here. None of the current evidence forces a metaphysical conclusion, but, and this is what the researchers themselves have been saying more and more openly in the last few years, the absence of forced metaphysical conclusions is not the same as confidence that the current picture will hold. Some of the most experienced people in this field have started to say publicly that they are no longer sure what the right picture is. The neuroscientist in New York has said it in interviews. The neuroscientist in California, one of the major figures in consciousness research for the last 40 years, who spent most of his career defending the view that consciousness is what certain brain processes are like from the inside, published a book in 2024 in which he acknowledged that the view may not be adequate, that consciousness might be more fundamental than he had long assumed, and that the field might need to reconsider options it had previously dismissed. This is not the same as saying it has been proved that something survives death. It has not been proved. That's the wrong register for what is happening. What is happening is more like this. A picture that seemed settled is being reopened by people whose professional identity was invested in keeping it closed. They are not reopening it because they have been convinced by alternative views. They are reopening it because the evidence they have been generating does not fit the picture they had, and honesty requires saying so. What this means for the question we have been following is subtler than it might first appear. It does not mean we now know what happens when we die. We do not. It does not mean the ancient traditions were right all along. Some of what they said may have been right, and some may not have been, and the question of which parts is still, in 2026, an open scientific and philosophical question. What it means is closer to this: the conversation that the last 2,000 years of careful human thought have been having about death, with religious traditions on one side and secular rationalism on the other, and neither side quite able to show the other what was so obvious, has started to look less like a disagreement about known territory and more like an ongoing investigation into something we all have less access to than we had assumed. The materialist had thought they knew what happens. They didn't. The traditions had thought they knew what happens. They didn't either, at least not in the ways that could be checked. What both sides turned out to know, on reflection, was less than they had claimed, and the territory that lies between what they each reliably know is larger than either side had wanted to admit. Standing here in the middle of this shifting ground, the honest thing to say is something like this. The dying brain is active in ways we did not expect. Some people, in the last hours, briefly become themselves again in ways their diagnoses should not allow. Cardiac arrest survivors report organized experiences from periods when their brains should have been silent. None of this forces any conclusion about what, if anything, continues after death. All of it, put together, suggests that the line between living and dead is less sharp than the older picture had made it. Something is happening at that threshold that does not fit the models we brought to it. What that something is, an artifact, a new biology, a glimpse of something else, is not yet known. It may be known in our lifetimes. Research on these questions is accelerating. Instrumentation is improving. There are large prospective studies now underway, including one at New York University that plans to monitor 500 dementia patients with continuous electroencephalography through the end of life. If terminal lucidity has a neural signature, that study has a chance of finding it. If recalled experiences of death correlate with specific brain activity during cardiac arrest, better recording technology may eventually isolate the correlation. Whatever is happening at the threshold, it leaves traces, and our ability to read the traces is improving faster than our ability to interpret them. What we can already say, without speculation, is that the question is not dead. It was not killed, as some people had thought, by a century of neuroscience. It was not settled, as others had thought, by religious tradition. It is still open, and the openness has a different texture now than it had 50 years ago because we know more, and some of what we know has not turned out to confirm what anyone expected. This puts a person in an unusual position for a human being thinking about their own eventual death. For most of history, a person facing the question had to choose a frame, religious, secular, stoic, skeptical, and work out their peace from inside that frame. The frames did not talk to each other, and the evidence either side had was not the kind that moved the other side. What has changed in the last few decades is that the evidence is starting to be the kind that is harder to dismiss from either side. Not enough to decide the question, enough to keep it genuinely open for the first time in a long while as an empirical question rather than merely a metaphysical one. An empirical question you do not yet have the answer to is a different kind of thing from a metaphysical question you have picked a side on. It asks you to wait. It asks you to not know. It asks you to hold the possibility that reality might turn out to be different from any of the pictures you currently have available, including your own. Whether this is a consoling thing to hear or an unsettling one probably depends on what you had been hoping for. Some people wanted the question settled, in whichever direction would let them stop worrying about it. This position will not settle the question for them. Other people were comfortable with the question being open, but thought the openness was a kind of philosophical acknowledgement of our limits, not a live scientific situation. For them, the news that the question is still being actively investigated, with real new data coming in, is either exciting or unwelcome, depending on how they feel about the idea of their old framework being disturbed. For almost everyone, though, there is something available to take from this. The fear of death, for most people, is in part a fear of knowing something terrible, of knowing that extinction is total, that nothing is preserved, that the person they have been is about to end. Part of what has changed in this particular moment of history is that the knowing has loosened. The confident extinction is total story no longer sits quite where it did. What has moved into its place is not an alternative story. It is a pause, a place where the question still lives, held open by evidence rather than by wishful thinking, and where a reasonable person can, if they choose, simply stop being sure. Stopping being sure is not the same as being hopeful. It is something else. It is being willing to not know about the one question it has always been hardest to not know about. That is a position most people have never been offered in a form they could trust. It is being offered now by the shape of the research itself to anyone willing to listen, which leaves, still, the other half of the question. The half that was never really about the hereafter. The half that was about what was worth doing in the time we are here for, while the answer to the larger question hangs in the air, waiting to be found. About that half, we have had answers from many directions, and some of them have been worth listening to, and some are worth listening to again, now that we have heard them all. In the autumn of 1973, in a hospital in Vancouver, a cultural anthropologist in his late 40s was dying of colon cancer, and a journalist had come to interview him. The anthropologist's name was Ernest Becker. He had spent the last decade writing about death, specifically about the ways human beings organize their lives to avoid looking at it. His latest book, The Denial of Death, was in the bookstores. It would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize the following spring, 2 months after Becker was already in the ground. The journalist, a man named Sam Keane, had come to ask whether the book's arguments had held up for their author now that he was in the position of having to apply them to himself. Becker, propped up in his hospital bed, was in pain. He was on morphine. He was 50 years old, which was not old enough to feel like a reasonable time to be there. And he said something in the interview that became one of the most frequently quoted lines of his career. "This is a test," he said, "of everything I've been writing. We shall see." What he had been writing was a picture of what culture is for. His claim, developed through the book, was that every human society is, underneath whatever else it seems to be doing, a defense against the knowledge of death. We are, he argued, the only animals that fully understand we are going to die, and the understanding is unbearable. No creature can function with the steady awareness of its own extinction pressing at the front of consciousness, so we construct something to push it back. We build things that we call meaningful, and we participate in them, and the participation gives us the sense that we are part of something that will not simply end when our bodies do. He called these constructions immortality projects. They took different forms in different cultures. In some, the form was literal, religious systems that promised an afterlife, a continuation past the body. In others, it was symbolic, a nation that would outlast the citizen, a family line that would carry the name, a work of art that would outlive the artist, a reputation, a child, a cause. What they all had in common was that they gave the individual a way to attach themselves to something larger than their brief biological window, and through that attachment to feel less terrified of the window closing. Becker did not think these projects were cynical, exactly, or stupid, or unworthy. He thought they were necessary. Without them, he believed most people would simply be paralyzed by the knowledge of what is coming. The cultures that have learned to build these structures have done so because the structures serve a real psychological function. The problem, in his view, was not that people invested in immortality projects. The problem was that people did not know they were doing it. They believed their nation was straightforwardly the best nation, rather than noticing that part of what made it feel so important was its role in shielding them from extinction. They believed their religion was straightforwardly true, rather than noticing that part of what made belief so attractive was the specific consolation it offered. They believed their work mattered absolutely, rather than noticing that the mattering was partly doing work for them, carrying a psychological load they did not want to carry themselves. The unawareness, Becker thought, was the dangerous thing, because an immortality project that you don't know is an immortality project will have unexpected effects. It will make you fight bitterly for your nation because its survival is standing in for yours. It will make you hate members of other religions because their existence threatens the system that protects you. It will make you sacrifice other things, your relationships, your health, your time, for the project, because the project is doing work you don't realize it's doing. Civilizations, he thought, were driven to war and atrocity not despite their immortality projects, but through them. We do terrible things for reasons that, if we saw them clearly, we would not endorse. But we do not see them clearly because the seeing would require giving up the protection, and the protection is what lets us get out of bed. He did not offer, in the book, a solution. He was not that kind of writer. He offered a diagnosis. He thought the human condition was essentially tragic, in the precise sense that what we need to function is not something we can afford to examine too closely, and what we can examine honestly is not something we can stably function on. This is not a popular position. It was not popular at the time. It is not popular now, but it has not, in 50 years, been convincingly refuted, and it has shaped an enormous amount of subsequent research into why human beings behave the way they do when mortality is on their minds. A few years after Becker died, 3 American psychologists took his argument into the laboratory. Their names were Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky, and they set out to do something Becker himself had not, to test the claims experimentally. What they developed over the next 2 decades was an enormous body of research showing that when you remind people, even subtly, of their own eventual death, their behavior changes in predictable ways. They become more defensive of their cultural worldview. They become more hostile to people who hold different views. They become more punitive toward people they perceive as violating their group's norms. They become, in short, more like the kind of creature Becker had described, gripped by an anxiety they cannot consciously name, acting in ways that protect a structure they do not know they are protecting. The research is unsettling. It is unsettling partly because it keeps replicating, which in contemporary psychology is not something you can take for granted. And it is unsettling because it means Becker was probably right about something very basic. We are, most of us, running on mortality anxiety in ways we do not notice, and the anxiety is doing a lot of the driving. There is another figure worth mentioning here because he worked on the same territory from a different angle, and what he found went somewhere Becker did not quite go. His name was Irvin Yalom. He was an American psychiatrist. For decades, he ran a practice in Palo Alto that specialized in part in people who were dying, cancer patients mostly, people who had been told they had months or weeks and who had come to therapy because they wanted to figure out how to spend the time. Yalom listened to hundreds of these people over his career, and he eventually wrote a book that tried to distill what he had learned from them. The book was called Staring at the Sun, and it was in some ways a reply to Becker. Yalom agreed that the fear of death was structural, and that most of what we call ordinary life is in some sense a management of this fear. But he had noticed in his patients something Becker had not much dwelled on. He had noticed that some of them, in the final months, stopped needing the management. Not because they had achieved some spiritual breakthrough, and not because they had talked themselves into consolations. Something else. They had, it seemed, reached a relationship with their own ending in which the fear had become a part of the situation rather than the thing organizing the situation. They could think about it, they could talk about it, they could still prefer not to die, but the grip of the fear, the way it had been running their life up until then, had loosened. What Yalom thought was happening when this happened was the arrival of a particular kind of clarity about what had mattered. His patients, facing death, tended to rearrange their priorities in ways they described as having been obvious in retrospect. The relationships got more attention, the small pleasures got more attention. The ambitions that had looked so urgent 6 months ago looked, from the new vantage, like someone else's concerns. What remained, what still felt like it was worth doing, was a narrower and more honest set of things. And once the narrower set had been identified, the terror had less to grip. He had a phrase for one specific piece of this, rippling, he called it. He had noticed that many of his patients in their last months were comforted by the thought that their effect on other people would persist after them. Not in the grand form of a named legacy, but in a smaller, diffuse way. The kindness they had shown a stranger would be carried forward. The way they had raised their children would shape those children's children. The small things would propagate outward like ripples, and although the person in the center of the ripples would not be there, the ripples would be real and would keep going, and the thought of them was, surprisingly, enough. This is different from Becker's picture, or at least a supplement to it. Becker had said, people build immortality projects to avoid the fact that they will end. Yalom was saying some people, near the end, stop needing the project and find something quieter that does the same work without any of the self-deception. The ripples are real. They do continue. The acknowledgement of them does not require you to believe in anything beyond what can be observed. There is a scene from a book most people have read at some point that belongs here too. In the novella we started with 17 chapters ago, a judge named Ivan Ilyich is in his final hours. He has been screaming on and off for 3 days. The doctors have given up. His wife has come and gone and come again. His son, a boy he has barely paid attention to in years, has crept into the room and is standing by the bed holding his hand. Ivan, for the first time in many days, looks at him. He notices the boy. He notices that the boy is suffering. Something in him shifts. He feels, unexpectedly, pity for his son, for his wife, for everyone in the room who is watching him die and suffering because of it. And the pity changes something. It is as if the room, which has been a dark place for 3 days, fills with a kind of light. Tolstoy writes it exactly like that. Ivan looks for his fear. He looks for the death he had been running from. It is, he discovers, not there. Where is it, he thinks? Where is that fear of death? It is nowhere. Instead, there is only light. He is surprised. Then he is not surprised. Then he dies. You can read this scene as a conversion. Tolstoy, by this point in his life, had become a kind of radical Christian, and some readers take the light as a religious image, a glimpse of God at the moment of dying. You can read it as a neurological artifact, the mind, starved of oxygen, producing experiences that feel significant but are simply the last firings of a collapsing system. You can read it as a symbol. The ending of the fear is the ending of the life that had been lived in the shadow of the fear, and Tolstoy is describing in image what Yalom's patients described in interviews. All 3 readings are available, and none of them exhausts the scene because the scene is not doing the work of argument. It is doing the work of showing. What it shows is a possibility, not a guarantee, not a promise, just a possibility that some people, at the end, stop being afraid, not because they have figured anything out, and not because they have been converted, and not because the conditions of their dying are unusually gentle. They stop being afraid because something in them, in those last hours, simply lets go. The project that had been running the fear is set down. What replaces it is not triumph. What replaces it in the accounts we have is something like pity or love or quiet attention, a turning toward the people in the room rather than the abyss outside it. This does not answer the large question. It does not tell us what is on the other side of the threshold. What it tells us is something smaller and, in its way, more immediately useful. Whatever is on the other side of the threshold, the passage across is not always a catastrophe. It is sometimes, in the testimony of people who are in it, something that was not what they had been afraid it would be. The fear, on close approach, turned out to be aimed at a version of the event that did not match the event itself. This may be temperament. It may be luck. It may be the result of the life that preceded it. A life that had been lived in such a way that by the time the ending arrived, there was less left to be afraid of losing, because what had mattered had already been attended to. Yalom thought it was mostly this last thing. His patients who came to the final months with the least terror were the ones who, in the months before, had been willing to do the rearranging. Not everybody can. Not everybody gets the chance. But for those who can and do, the arrival of the end seems, in the accounts, to be less of the thing they had prepared themselves to face and more of something else, something quieter, something that did not require them to be as brave as they thought it would. Whether this possibility is available to any particular person is not knowable in advance. It is, in a way, the final gamble. A person can spend their life cultivating the conditions under which it might be available, paying attention to the people around them, investing less in the immortality projects that will not survive the crossing anyway, letting the small pleasures matter, making peace where peace is available, and at the end, they may still be terrified. There are no guarantees, but the preparation is worth doing, not because it guarantees anything, but because it changes the life that precedes the ending, regardless of how the ending itself arrives. Which leaves, at the end of a long following of voices, the question we began with, back in a specific body lying in a specific bed, somewhere near the edge of sleep. The question was never whether an answer would come. The question, all along, was what to do with the fact that no answer could come. We have followed now almost every serious attempt that has been made to sit with that fact. A room full of them now, pressing on the same door. Imagine, for a minute, that the rooms they were in have all been brought together. The Athenian cell in the late afternoon, with the cup on the bench and the friends sitting on the floor. The garden at the edge of Athens, a generation later, with the old man on his couch writing his last letter. The judge's apartment in Petersburg, the bedroom upstairs, the ladder in the corner that nobody has thought to move. The battlefield in northern India, the dust not yet raised, the audience hall in the Greek-ruled kingdom, the king leaning forward, the mountain in Tibet, a woman burying a manuscript in the rock, the university lecture hall in Freiburg, the students writing down what they could hear, the opera stage in Prague, the study in Dresden with a poodle under the desk and a copy of the Upanishads open, the workshop in Konya, the reed cooling in the hands of its carver, the Parisian cafe in the middle of the occupation, the house on Stories Way, the evening light through the window, the hospital room in Vancouver, the hospice bed in the American Midwest, the Michigan laboratory with its EEG traces on the screen, the bedroom in Cincinnati, the teleporter booth just installed, all of them in one room now. The light is low, nobody is saying anything. Each of them, separately, had been asked the same question, what happens when we die? And each of them had answered. Some spoke quickly, some took their time, some offered an image, some offered an argument, some offered a practice, some refused the question and offered instead a different question they thought was better. Sitting with their answers, now that we have heard all of them, it is striking how many there are, and how differently they are shaped, and how, despite the differences, there are patterns that repeat, as though several people, looking at the same object from different sides, keep reporting shapes that are not quite the same but are not quite unrelated either. Some of them said the problem is not real. Epicurus said, there will be no one there for the problem to be a problem for. Wittgenstein, in his austere way, said almost the same thing from a different angle. Death is not in the life. The world does not change at death. It ends. Both were pointing out that what we fear when we fear our own extinction is a condition we cannot actually be in. The fear is aimed at something that, when it arrives, will not be anyone's experience. That, they thought, ought to change the fear. Some of them said the problem is real, and also the consolation we thought we wanted would not be a consolation. Williams said, if you actually had what you think you want, more life, indefinitely, you would, after a long enough stretch, find that it was not what you wanted at all. The structure of wanting requires an ending. The ending is not the enemy of the wanting. It is part of what makes the wanting possible. Remove it, and the life you imagined you were saving turns into something you would not have chosen to live. Some of them said, the you that you think is ending was never there to begin with. The Buddha, through Nagasena, said it first, about the chariot. Parfit said it again, 23 centuries later, about the teleporter. You look for the self that is supposed to be continuous, and it is not there. There is only the process, branching or not, connected or not, and the process is not the kind of thing that can die in the way you had been afraid it could die. What is actually there is, at most, a pattern, and patterns can end without anyone being there to suffer the ending. Some of them said, "The you that you are at the deepest level cannot die, because it was never the kind of thing death applies to." Krishna said it in the chariot on the battlefield, about the self that is not slain when the body is slain. Schopenhauer said it in Dresden with the drop that returns to the sea. Rumi said it in Konya with the reed that returns to the riverbed. 3 men across 2,500 years and 3 continents, holding up images that rhyme with each other in ways the images' authors could not have arranged. Some of them said, "Stop asking what is on the other side and look at how you are living on this one." Heidegger said it through the grammar of everyday speech and the insistence that your own death was yours, specifically, not one's, and that holding it as yours was the condition for actually being in the life you had. Camus said it through Sisyphus walking down the hill, refusing consolation, refusing despair, simply continuing. Becker said it by showing us the machinery that was keeping us distracted. Yalom said it by pointing out what some of his patients found near the end when the distractions stopped working, that a narrower, more honest set of things attended to directly was enough. Some of them offered a practice. The Bardo Thodol offered the longest one, an entire curriculum rehearsed in life for the moments that would come when life was no longer the right word. Every bardo a training, every passage a preparation, and some of them didn't offer anything exactly except the report of what they had found when they got to the end. Wittgenstein, on the last night, said he had had a wonderful life. Tolstoy's character, in the last moments, looked for the fear and found the light instead. Epicurus, on the day he died, wrote that it was the happiest day of his life. Not everyone, at the end, finds these things, but some people do, and the pattern of who finds them, when you look across the accounts, does not seem random. Something about the life that preceded made a difference, not guaranteed, but weighted. And over all of this, through the last 12 years, a separate conversation has been developing. The conversation of the instruments, the brain that surges into heightened coherence at the moment the heart stops. The patients who come back with organized memories from periods when no organized memory was supposed to be possible. The dementia patients who somehow in the final hours know their children's names again. None of this proves anything about what happens after. But all of it suggests that the simple picture, brain goes, mind goes, nothing further to discuss, was resting on fewer confirmations than anyone had realized. What would it look like to hold all of this at once? Not to choose among them, not to decide the Buddhist was right, or the Epicurean, or Heidegger, or Parfit, or Camus, or Rumi. You cannot choose. They contradict each other in ways that cannot be reconciled without doing violence to what each of them actually said. Krishna's permanent self is not Nagasena's patternless process. The Epicurean non-event is not Heidegger's own most possibility. Williams's refusal of eternity is not the Gita's acceptance of it. The voices are genuinely different. The question they were answering is, underneath, the same question, but the answers are not compatible, and still, you can be at any given moment more in one of their rooms than the others. You can be on a certain kind of afternoon, standing near Epicurus in the garden, finding the argument clean and sufficient. You can be at 3 in the morning closer to Heidegger, feeling the specific pressure of your own finitude in your own particular life. You can be at the bedside of someone you love, closer to Yalom's patience than to any of the arguing philosophers. You can be, on rare evenings, somewhere in the neighborhood of the Bardo Thodol, noticing that the edge of sleep is a place. You can be reading a letter from someone long gone, closer to the reed than you have ever been. None of these is your final answer. None of them needs to be. What they are, collectively, is a set of neighborhoods. Your mind lives at different hours in different ones of them. Knowing that the neighborhoods exist and that people have lived in each of them with seriousness and that none of them has the right to claim that the others were not also lit is what we have instead of an answer. It is not an answer. It is probably better than an answer, for reasons that are hard to say directly, but that may be the thing this whole long conversation has been circling around. Here is one way to say it. An answer to the question what happens when we die would, if we had it, be a piece of information. It would go somewhere in our heads, among the other things we know. And once we had it, the question would stop being a question. It would become settled. Whatever its content, the settling would, almost certainly, do something to our relationship with the rest of our life. If the answer were everything ends completely, we would have to fold our days around that. If the answer were you go on and are reunited with those you loved, we would have to fold our days around that. Either way, the living would be shaped by the answer, and the shape would be tighter than the shape we have now. What we have now is something looser. The question is live. It has not been settled for anyone, including the people most confident they have settled it, and the looseness means that the living, the days as we are actually having them, do not have to organize themselves around an answer that was never available. They can organize themselves around something else, around the specific people who are around the specific tasks that are at hand, around the light at a particular hour, or the conversation at a particular table, or the long walk home at the end of a particular afternoon. Each of these is more than sufficient to fill the life of any creature built the way we are built. None of them requires knowing what is past the last breath. The question was, perhaps, never really asking for an answer. It was asking for a relationship. What kind of relationship do you want to have with the fact that one day the version of you that is listening to this will not be there to listen to anything? You can have many kinds. You can have the kind that runs from it and gives your days a shape of flight. You can have the kind that pretends to have solved it and gives your days the shape of certainty, whether or not the certainty is earned. You can have the kind that pulls the question close and lets it press on every hour and gives your days the shape Heidegger described. Or you can have the kind where you simply let the question be there, where it is a presence in your life, like weather, sometimes close and sometimes distant, but not denied and not performed. Where you live your life next to it and let it do its quiet work on how you spend the hours, and do not demand that it answer itself before you will let it be. This last possibility is the one the whole conversation, it seems to me, has been pointing toward, not as a prescription, as a possibility, available to anyone at any point, without belief, without argument, without ceremony. Just a small private arrangement with the fact of the ending, not a resolution, a relationship. There is something worth noticing here at the end about the body that has been listening. You have been here for a long time. The room is dark. The light outside, if there is any, is not much. The breath, if you have been attending to it at all, has probably been slowing. The weight of the body in the bed or the chair has probably been settling further in. Something is happening that is very close to the thing that we have, for this long evening, been circling. Not death, something next door to it. The gentle letting go that the body does at the edge of sleep, that we have been doing all our lives, that the traditions noticed long before we had words for it. Every night, a small version of what the question is asking about. Every night, the letting go, the slipping under, the time that will not be in your memory tomorrow, and every morning, the return. So far, always. It is, on reflection, a gentle rehearsal. Most of us do not even notice we are having it. The traditions that paid attention, the Bardo Thodol most explicitly, but in its way every tradition that recognized the kinship between sleep and what comes after, were noticing something that is simply there, under the ordinary hours, offered freely to anyone who wants to look at it. You are next to it now. You are near it in a way you cannot quite name but can almost certainly feel if you put your attention on the weight of yourself against the bed, on the slowing breath, on the particular quality of the quiet that has developed over the last little while. It is not frightening. It is familiar. It has been with you all your life. The question, the big version of the question, is not going to be answered tonight. It has not been answered in 2,500 years. It is not going to be answered by any single voice or any single argument or any single body of evidence. It is going to continue to be what it has been, a large, open question held by more people than we can count, across more cultures than we can name, for longer than recorded history, with no resolution in sight. But the small version of the question, the version that is under your skin right now, that one has a shape you can meet. You will sleep. If you are lucky, and most nights people are lucky, you will wake up. One day at a time you will not choose, you will not wake up. That day is somewhere ahead. It is not tonight. Between now and then are a number of days unknown to you, during which you will be as you have been, the person you are. Those days are what you have. They are not a rehearsal for anything. They are the whole of it. Let us leave it there. Listen. The people we have listened to tonight all died. Every last one of them. Socrates in 399 before our era at 69. Epicurus in 270 at 71. Krishna, if he lived at all, well before that. Nagasena sometime in the 2nd century. Padmasambhava in the 8th. Yeshe Tsogyal a little after. Rumi in 1273 in Konya. Tolstoy in 1910 at a country railway station, having run away from his own house at 82. Schopenhauer in 1860, Heidegger in 1976, Wittgenstein in 1951 on the evening we have already visited, Camus in 1960 in a car crash he had told a friend a few months earlier was the absurdest way he could think of to die, Williams in 2003, Becker in 1974, 2 months before his Pulitzer, Parfit in 2017. Every one of them by now in whatever state the answer turns out to be. Whatever the answer is, they are there in it. They got there ahead of us. They are, in that sense, waiting. It is a strange thought to leave the evening on. Not sad, exactly. Not frightening either. Just noticed. If you are still awake, you can let the room go dark now. If you have been drifting for some time already, you can let the drift finish its work. The question will be here in the morning. It will be here for every morning you have. So will the people such as they are who made it through long enough to have been part of this particular conversation. So will the ordinary fact of the day coming. And so, for tonight at least, will you? Good night.